I'm Ben Falla, the owner of ZeroToGeek.com, an interactive teacher, and I'm the author of HTML5 Data Visualization Cookbook. I'm an Adobe ACP and part of their advisory board. As the web is evolving, your applications need to continuously evolve and become more efficient and more organized. Traditional development at some point just doesn't cut it anymore and actually harms your productivity. But what's the next step? Many of the development training courses are way too complex, filled with jargon that is just not helpful for you to transition. The skills you will develop through this course is the fundamentals of object-oriented programming with actionable insight that will help you become more efficient, but based on live examples. We will show you how to turn less efficient code into powerful, reusable, smart logic. By the end of this course, not only will you know object-oriented programming, but it will transform the way you think and work on a daily basis. The great part of this course is you can get through it really quickly in just a few hours. So let's get started. Welcome to Chapter 1, which will be dedicated to creating a digital clock. In this lesson, we're going to set up our expectations with looking at our source files and how they're constructed. And we're also going to set up our first HTML and CSS that we're going to be using throughout the next chapter. So let's jump right into it. To Chapter 1, and in this chapter, we're building a clock, a digital clock. Now, this lesson is going to be about setting up expectations, so let's start setting them up. So first of all, we're assuming that you know some JavaScript, and we're not going to talk about actually the JavaScript language, but our focus is going to be about building objects and how to build object-oriented programming. With that said, there's a few things that you really need to have access to be able to enjoy this course. One is you want to make sure that you have access to your console and to your inspector. The way you do that is in your local browser. In my case, I'm using Firefox. Just right-click in an area and go into Inspect Element. If you can't find that, find documentation on how to do it on your own in your current browser, or install a plugin that will enable you to have access to your inspector and your console. We're not going to talk further about this because it's just something that we're going to use as it's something that we expect every JavaScript developer to know about. Just make sure that you know how to do that before you move on into the actual lessons. With that said, let's look at our source files for a second. I'm going to bring in the file, and you'll see that our source files will have an art folder, a CSS folder, and a JS folder. I'm going to always work off of the end file, but I'm going to always leave you with a start file where you could start from there and have a clean slate from the beginning of the chapter. You'll also find in our CSS folder a start CSS if we're making any modifications to the CSS. If not, you'll just have the link to the updated chapter if we made any changes in the chapter. Last but not least is the JavaScript as well, where you'll always find a start file for it and the actual file where you'll have the end result of our work. Without further ado, I want to jump right in. Now that we've talked about the source files, the console, the inspector, I want to start actually setting up our HTML and the CSS, so we'll actually see here a clock, although it's not going to be working in this lesson because in the next lesson we'll actually start working on activating it. Well, with that said, choose your favorite editor. I'm not going to talk about the loading of JavaScript. I'm going to jump right into our HTML, and in our HTML, in our body of our HTML, I'm going to create basically a new div layer, and I'm going to give that div layer a name of content. And the reason is because I want to center my content. So I want to have an external div that I'll be able to control the alignment of our content, and an internal div which will actually have our clock inside of it, and I'll give it the ID of clock. And that way I could refer to it later on whenever I want to talk to it from our JavaScript. I'll have an easy way to fetch that item and talk to it. Last but not least, I'm going to add in our HTML a pseudo clock right now of 0000. Now, if I save this and go back into my browser, we'll see that our content is going to be aligned. It's going to be in the font we want it to be because I already set the CSS for the font to work. And let me show you that I've done that. First of all, I imported a Google font from the Google Fonts library, and you could find many other fonts if you just Google Fonts and just font that works for you. You could bake in that font, and then in your CSS, just make sure in your font family of your body of or whatever you want to actually have that font, to have that actual font as the first thing that it picks. All right, so now that we have our content and we've seen it, that it's sitting there on the top here, there's a couple of things we want to do to it. For one, we want it to actually be centered in our stage. So to do that, I'm going to go ahead back into my CSS. And this time I want to add a rule for our content. So I'm going to go into my CSS. I'm going to create a new selector rule. And I'm going to go ahead and set inside my rule that I want my position to be fixed because I want to position in a certain spot. Next is I want to set my top position, and I'm going to put a relative position of 50%, which would put us in the center of the screen. And also for our left, I'm going to put it in our center of our screen. Now, this is going to be in the center, but it's not going to be the perfect center. And the reason is because if we do that, it's going to be aligned a little bit to the side. And to make this a lot more obvious, let's go to our clock itself and make its font much bigger. So back in our CSS, I'm going to go ahead and just quickly create a clock rule as well. And for our clock, I'm going to ask the font size to be 100 pixels. And now if I do that and I go back into my browser and click on refresh, it's going to be a lot more noticeable that although we're starting from the center point, we want this content to actually be in the center. Now, a fantastic way to do this if we're working in CSS3 is to add a rule into our content area that will transform it. Now, if you want to work in CSS2 and just make your content a little bit more secure, the only way for you to do that is to actually assign here also a value of padding. So you could set here a padding top and set your padding top to be, if you know your font size height, which we don't, then I could sit around there and play with the pixels and say, okay, let me push this a little bit more to the top, or in this case, I'm pushing it a little bit more to the bottom. So I would probably push it a little bit, padding top minus 50, and then I would push it up to a place where I want it to be. But really this, padding and margins and all these great things are just not, in this case, it'd probably be margin. So I'd be like margin top and then like minus 100 pixels, let's say, and that would push it 100 pixels up. But really, in reality, this isn't a great solution. And that is because what if our content changes or its size changes? We have to put here direct CSS. So the CSS3 option is so much more powerful. There I just set a transform, and I set my transform to translate the position. And I basically translate the position by saying, hey, I want to move you by 50% of your size to the top and to the left. I'm basically shifting my content, and it actually will relate to whatever the size of my content is. So when I use a transform translate, if I go back into my browser and click on refresh, it's going to be smack right there in the middle. And even if I resize or change anything in my content, it's always going to change inside of the center position. This is all I wanted to talk about in this intro lesson where we set up and configured our HTML and CSS. In the next lesson, we're going to move into our JavaScript file where we're going to start actually figuring out how to manipulate our content. Before we could really start coding in JavaScript, we have to make sure that our document is completely loaded. To do that, we're going to use the onLoad callback. And we're going to see what a callback is right now, but really we're going to dig much deeper into it when we talk about events and callbacks in a later chapter. But for now, let's see what that is and how do we actually know when our document completes loading so we can then start tweaking it. All right, let's get started. I must assume that you know some things because you've worked in JavaScript. This chapter is going to be about building a clock. We're not going to dig too deep into the object-oriented world, but in the process, we're going to rehearse things that we hope you already know. So let's go ahead and do it. Now, the next topic that I want to talk about is, for us, before we even start approaching our document, before we could even start working with it, we must make sure that our whole document has been loaded. And the reason is very simple. If we try to approach our object before it's completely loaded, then things won't work the way they should. Now, it's very simple to get things to work the way we want to, and we're basically going to create a function, and I'm going to call it onReady. And our onReady function, its job is going to be to basically start our code. From here, we're going to start actually actioning everything. So I'm going to set here, hello chapter 1. Now, this onReady call should only be called once our document and all of its assets are completed loaded, so we can then approach and talk to specific elements in our page. Now, the most simple and easy way to do that is to approach our window itself and say, hey, Mr. Window, unload. Whenever you're loaded and you're ready, just call our onReady function. And that's literally all we had to do. And once we've done that, whenever we go to our application and click on refresh, we're going to see that trace in our console whenever our application is loaded and ready. Now, just as a side note, we're not going to talk what functions are. We're not going to talk about what objects are in general, not really, because that's something that you should have known already before approaching this course. But I do want to talk really quickly about this event because these are things that we're going to explore a lot more deeply in a later chapter, which are called events and callbacks. In this case, we're working with a callback that basically we're sending in our function, and we're telling the window, hey, whenever you're done loading, just trigger this function onReady. And then behind the scenes, it literally just calls onReady whenever it is ready. We're going to actually create our own callbacks and our own events later on in later chapters. But for now, that's all you really need to know about that process to get your application rolling. As long as you go into your browser and you can see in your console that output of Hello Chapter 1, then you're set, you're ready, and we're ready to continue on exploring the remainder of this chapter. Now, another note that I wanted to just say is that you could use also third-party tools such as jQuery, and in the case that you use jQuery, there are different methods and you should look into the documentation there or check one of our courses on jQuery. All right, so without further ado, that's it about setting up and getting ready and having your code ready to be coded. And for the remainder of all chapters, we're going to always have our code starting off from our onReady function. That's where our code will actually start and initialize. In the next lesson, we're going to go ahead and actually take a look at objects, and mainly the time object, because we want to know what is the actual time right now. So we're going to see you in the next lesson when we figure out what the time is and even integrate it into our browser so that our browser will display the actual current time. So see you in the next lesson when we explore that. We're done with configurations, we're done with setups. It's time for us to actually talk about objects. Objects could do a lot of things, and we're going to explore all of them really in the next few chapters. First of all, what is an object? And an object could be anything tangible. It could be my bottle of water that I was drinking earlier. That is an object in the real world. And in programming, we might just call a variable and just call it an object. It is that simple. Now, we're not going to talk about the intricacies of difference between an object and a primitive data type because that's something that you should have known from the basics of JavaScript, but we are going to talk about what objects do. So in this lesson, we're going to see how do we actually instantiate and create a new object. We're going to start with the date object. And in a later chapter, we're also going to learn how to create our own objects. So let's jump right into it where we're going to look at the date object and explore the differences between functions and methods and variables and properties, and we're going to make it all very, very logical. So let's do it. Ready? Because now we're going to see the first object in our course. Well, actually we've seen an object, but we didn't create a new one. We saw the window object, which is an object that represents our whole window. Now, inside of our console, inside of our onReady, we're going to be working a lot with the console log because it's going to help us see things as we're working through. What I want to do is I want to create a new variable, and I'm going to call it date, and I want to set inside of that variable the current date. Now, JavaScript has a lot of pre-built objects that you could work with. The most primitive object is the object, and we're going to look at it at a later date, not too late. And the way we create new objects, the syntax is basically the word new, a space, the name of the object, and then we open and close a parenthesis just like we do with a function. And literally what we're doing here is we're telling JavaScript, hey, create for me a new object and set it inside of the date object. Now, in our case, I want to actually get the date, so I'm not going to create a new object, I'm going to create a new date, which is an object that already exists in JavaScript. It's called date and enables us to fetch information that is date relatable. Now, if I create a new date and I just go ahead and immediately go to my console and log out the value that I got back in my variable, we're going to see something really interesting. If I go ahead and I click on refresh, we're going to see that by default, our date object, first of all, we can have access to it as an object as well. By default, to output the current date exactly the way it is. which is basically a string representation of the object. We're going to learn about how could you create objects of this nature as well in a later date, not too late. So, all right, so now that we said that, we know that, we configured that, the next step for us is to go ahead and we want to actually access the actual time information. To access the time information, this object has methods and properties. Now, contrary to traditional JavaScript where we would create variables, when an object has a variable inside of it, we call it a property. When an object has a function inside of it, we call it a method. Now, the differentiation is important, although you don't have to worry about the semantics too much initially, but it actually is important. What it means is, when we're talking about a method, it means this isn't only a floating function like this floating function. This function belongs to something. It belongs to a specific object, and in other words, that function has access to that object because it lives inside of that object. Same true for properties. That property belongs to that specific object itself. So in our case, every property from now on when we call variables really inside of an object, we're going to call it a property because it's a variable that belongs to an object, and that makes sense. Just like your eye color is one of your properties, but the color blue is not one of your properties. That is the big difference between properties and variables, methods and functions. That is all you really need to know at this stage, but you're going to know a lot more about it as we continue on to further chapters that will be more object-oriented programming centered. So now that we have the date object, I'm going to go back into our browser because I want to show you what we could do with a new date. So I'm just going to go into my console here and I'm going to type new date. And I'm going to go ahead and try to get specific properties. So when I create a new date, if I open up that element and I just click into it, we're going to see that it has a lot of different properties. And among those properties are get date, get day, get full year, get minutes, and so on and so forth. And what we really want to get is we want to get our minutes and we want to get our hours. So I'm going to go ahead and just call that function from within our console. If I go to my date and I ask to get the hours, look what will happen. And it's a function. And again, it's not only a function, but it's a method, which means it belongs to this object. Contrary to a get hours, if it was a function, it wouldn't know where to get those hours from. But because it belongs to the date, it's going to get those hours from that specific date object that we've created. And a hint to that is that we could have different dates running at the same time that are running different dates. All right, I could very easily create another object here, which would be date 2, and have their completely different date configured there. So if I go ahead and refresh my browser just to see that, we're going to see that our content that's going to come back is going to be 5 because the time right now is 5 in the morning in Eastern Time, New York. So if I go ahead and I get my hours and I also want to get my minutes, and really I also want to get my seconds. So if I go ahead here and I just try to get my minutes as well, I'm going to just do a quick little console here, and I'm going to try to get my minutes. And I'm going to try to get my seconds as well. And if I go through that whole process and I click on refresh, we're going to see that we're going to get that the time is 5 in the morning, it's 5:47 in the morning, and 7 seconds. The next step for us is to actually integrate this into our actual console and see it in action. And to do that, I am going to do it in the next lesson where we're going to actually start tweaking and playing with our content, retrieving that data that we got from our object and then setting it inside of our virtual clock. Not only are we going to do that, we're also going to configure it and set it so it could run every second because that's what clocks do. So we'll see you in the next lesson where we wrap up the creation of a clock and get our clock to start ticking. Unfortunately, different versions of different browsers have different configurations when it comes to the way JavaScript is also how it works. There's features that are only available in some browsers while they're not available in others. And beyond that, there's also issues of configurativity, or basically how does our JavaScript interact with the elements outside of it, such as the CSS and the HTML. Now, we're not going to talk about the differences at all, and in general, I personally prefer working with third-party plugins such as jQuery because then I don't have to worry about is it going to work on specific browsers, because I know that they're going to worry about that in general, and I could worry about if my code is working to its best. We are going in this course to work with the built-in functions and the built-in methods, We're not going to dig too deep into how to get them to work in every specific browser. We're just going to get them to work in the browser that I'm working in, which is Firefox. Now, in general, all the methods and functions that we're going to be working with should work on every single browser, but there is always small compatibility issues when it comes to versions of browsers, and that's a topic that we're not going to explore. In this lesson, we're going to dedicate a bit of time to talk about that as we look into how to select elements from our HTML page using the getElementById, and also how do we change the content of our HTML page using the inner HTML. It's time for us to actually change our input because we want to actually set our actual time in the time area that we allocated. So to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually approach that element. And the way I approach the element is very simple, although let me just do it first. So I just type document.getElementById. And then I set the actual ID. In this case, I know that my ID is a clock, so I want to fetch the element with the ID of clock. Once I fetch the element with the ID of clock, I could save it into a variable or continue working with it. I'm just going to set this to my clock and set the value of my clock. Now that I have access to the clock, notice this is an object as well. Contrary to the date object that we actually created one and we went to the date constructor and said, hey, create a new date for us and set it inside of the variable of date. In line 10, we're not creating a new element, we're just fetching an element that already exists. The big difference between our date above here is that we're actually creating a new date. Contrary to that, when we're working on line 10, we're actually approaching the DOM, which is the document object model, and asking from our document to retrieve our div layer, our item with an ID of clock. And as we have an item with ID of clock, it's going to fetch it. Now, by the way, this is supported by all browsers really, since even IE 5.5, more or less. There are a couple of hiccups and bugs throughout, mainly Internet Explorer, surprisingly. And that is one of the reasons why a lot of times a lot of developers don't work directly with JavaScript, but they work with the plugins such as jQuery. In our case, we're working on pure JavaScript in case you just can't or won't work with a third-party plugin. So we're going to continue on, and we're not going to focus on that too much because now we have access to our clock, and it's time for us to go to our clock and change its inner HTML. And we could literally just send inside of here whatever we want. By setting that, and if I go in and I refresh my browser, we should see that our content should automatically update to whatever. And obviously whatever is not the content that we want to have there. We actually want to have the time in there. And before I even do that, I just want to say in general, again, inner HTML works on all modern browsers. It's not 100% complete in IE. It works. There's a few bugs and hiccups in IE. In general, if you work with a third-party tools such as jQuery to work into adding and removing content, usually you will avoid a lot of misconfigurations between different browsers. With that said, let's actually create the actual text that we want to send inside here. And literally what we want is we're going to take our hours. So I could go ahead and just copy that hours area, and I could concatenate it with the string separator of a colon. And I could go ahead and also add the minutes. I'm going to save it. I'm going to show you that this content went through. And if I click here on refresh, you're going to see the time now is 6 in the morning and 7 minutes and 11 seconds. And obviously we need to fix here some things because we want to have 06, 07, 011. And that's exactly what we're going to do in the next lesson, where we're going to work on the formatting, and we'll fix the formatting of our clock and also get it to start ticking. So see you in the next lesson when we confront those issues. We are seconds away from creating our first working clock, and literally that is how we are going to finish this chapter. How exciting. So let's just do it, right? Let's just finish creating our clock. So let's go back to our clock and actually get it to work. We have your two issues. One is that we need this clock to actually tick. And the second problem is we also want our format to actually showcase that it's 06, 07, and 11 seconds. So to do that, I'm going to go right back into my editor, and let's first fix this format thing. And to do that, I want to create a new function, and I'm going to create that function format digits. It's going to accept a value. It's going to return a value. And literally what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to ask if my value is greater, well, if it's smaller than 10. If our value is smaller than 10, I'm going to go ahead and tell them my value from now on, you're equal 0 plus our value. And there we go. So that will be our format digits. All that's really left for us to do is to wrap around this value around our digits that we're actually outputting. So if I go ahead and just wrap this function around those properties as well, all those properties, I click on save, go to my browser, click on refresh, we should have here a lovely clock that is undefined, undefined, undefined. And the reason is because we're not actually sending anything back. So I actually forgot to do a return and actually send the value back. So literally, if we have your value that is under 10, we're going to add 0 before the value and concatenate the original value that was a number, convert it into a string in the process. If not, we're just going to send the value back just the way it is. So if I go ahead and I save this, go back and click on refresh, it won't be undefined, undefined, undefined. And I can see that I have a big issue that I, by mistake, did the exact opposite of what I wanted to, because I said if my value is greater than 10, instead of if my value is smaller than 10. And that's actually what my intention was. And by the way, I always show my bugs because bugs are just a part of programming, and you want to have bugs and you want to show your bugs. You want to be confident with your bugs because people that don't have bugs are people that don't program, and people that don't program are people that are not taking this course. You're going to have bugs. I'm going to have bugs. We're going to have a good time together. And in the process, I'm also teaching you a very important thing that I think every programmer should know, and any programmer that's learning, is don't worry about bugs. Bugs are just part of nature. Now, the last thing that's left for me to do is actually make sure that also my element here updates as the seconds change. And to be able to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab this content and I'm going to pass it into a function. So I'm going to call this function update clock. And I'm going to go ahead and just grab all of this information right here. And I'm going to have to grab literally everything here. So if I copy all this, paste it right into our update clock, and I'm just going to get rid of my console update. I'm going to update all this information. And literally all that's left for me to do is to create a set interval, which is a function that will basically repeat call that specific function for as much duration of time that we want to. In our case, I want to update this clock. I want to call the update clock, and I want it to happen once a second. By the way, 1,000 is 1 second. It's in milliseconds. I don't remember if the first value was a second or the first value was a function, and the best way to do it is just check. You go back into your browser, you click on refresh. If it worked, then you know that it's good. If it didn't work, you know it's not good. Now, we only have one problem, and as you notice, initially we see that 0, 0 value for a second, and that's because we want to also call our update clock before even a second passes, and I'll just call that and set that and save that and go back into my browser and click on refresh. There we go, and now we have a clock that's ticking, that's working. We just have not really a problem, but if we look into our code, it is not completely efficient, and that's exactly what we're going to be solving in our next chapter. And this wraps up our introductory chapter to working with objects and working in JavaScript. The problem that we have right here is every time we call update clock, we're creating a new date object. We're fetching our element from the document each time around. We're calling and changing our hour each time. And all these calls, if we look into this, we see here there's one function call or object calls, object or function, right? So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. We have 8 different function calls each time we call our update clock. And the reason is because we don't have a lot of ways to save our information. Although we could create variables externally and store them externally, the problem with that is that we're overriding the global scope, and the more external variables that we create, the less optimized our code is visually also, and we might, if we were adding a lot of libraries, we could have also conflicts of different variable names. And that's exactly where objects come into the picture and make life a lot easier. In the next chapter, what we're going to do is we're first just going to move everything into objects. Even before we go into definitions and important things that you need to know about object-oriented programming, let's go from the first step, which is going to be to make things more simple and make things more logical. And as we progress, we're going to improve it more and more and more. So that's it. See you in chapter 2. I hope you enjoyed this chapter. And next chapter, things are going to start kicking up a notch and they're going to become a little bit harder, but don't worry, it's going to be fun and it's going to be fun, basically. All right, see you next lesson. Let's get started with chapter 2. In chapter 1, we learned a lot about just basic objects, and we kind of had a rehearsal over things that hopefully you are aware of already, and if not, you are aware now. In this chapter, we're going to dive into actually creating our own objects, and we're going to start with looking at how to create an object in general, And the really cool thing about this is that creating an object is very similar to creating a function. And we're going to see how that's done. And that's it. So in chapter 1, we created a digital clock that looks fabulous. But we do have a problem, and it's probably not a glaring problem. And really, that's the whole point of this course, to push us towards object-oriented programming. So if we look at our source files for a second, and I just copied all the files to our 2, and you could start from 2 start, but I'm always going to be in the 2 end, but you could always start from the start where you'll have all the stuff that I'm at. So just go ahead and you're going to have in the JavaScript area there --start. I'm not, because I'm going to basically modify the final file. All right. So one of the problems that we have here is that everything is very tied together. Although we only have your 2 functions, but we have also a set interval. And what if we wanted to create 5 clocks or 10 clocks? Over time, this is going to become really complicated and really complicate our code. Now, a really wonderful thing would be if we could abstract all these calls inside of these functions, and in that way, if we abstract things, we could then reuse them. Contrary, now we have hard-coded values, such as get that specific clock. And this hard-coded value, such as a hard-coded value of get the specific hour right now. What if we wanted to modify the date? What if we wanted to have a couple of digital clocks, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 or more with different times from different time zones? We can't really do it right now, and if we wanted to do it, it would be relatively complicated. So let's go ahead and start the process of simplifying things. Now, what I want to do is I'm going to start with not the traditional object-oriented way, but I'm just going to show you how to do it the easy, most simple way. There's nothing wrong with the simple, easy way, but as we progress throughout the course, you're going to see more sophisticated ways of doing exactly what we're going to do in this lesson. So I'm going to go ahead and instead of update clock, I'm going to create a new clock function. And I'm going to call this create clock. And create clock is basically going to return back an object. And I'm just going to go ahead and create here a new clock. I'm going to call it new object, because that's how we create a new object that has basically nothing inside of it. And I'm going to go ahead and return that clock to whoever is creating it. This is going to make sure that every time I create a new clock, I'm going to basically create a completely brand new clock each time. Perfect. So that's a good start. The next step that I want to do is I really want to capture this update clock, but I want to put it inside of this new object that right now is basically the most primitive basic object in JavaScript that doesn't really have a lot of methods, doesn't have a lot of functionality. I want to add this function right into that clock. Now, to do that is incredibly easy. All I really need to do is go ahead and call that variable, put a dot, and then write the name of the function that I want. So for example, update clock. Basically, I'm going to go ahead and just copy this whole function and literally paste it in the exact same place. Get rid of the name because we already have a name when we set the variable. And there we go. And let me just set our word wrap so we can see better. But basically, what I just did is I created a new function that is living inside of this object. And it's called update clock. Not only does it live inside of this object, it is uniquely of that object. So if I create a new clock over and over, each one of those clocks would have this function that belongs to that clock. What's really cool about this is that if I just go ahead and just create here a few variables and create clocks in them, I'm going to basically create separate clocks for each one. Very simple, very cool. Now, another, by the way, is when we have a function that belongs to an object, we call it a method. And it's not semantics. This is a function because it doesn't belong to anything, but this is a method. And it's a method because it belongs to a specific object. It belongs to this. All right. With that said, let's continue on and look at a few more things that we could do here. So for one is I created this update clock. It's inside of the method here. Beautiful. Now, traditionally what I do is I put a semicolon whenever we put a function inside of a variable in this construct, because it basically says that this is the end of the line. All this is one line. Now, the next thing that I want to do is I also want to move our format digits to that place. But even before I do that, if I just go ahead and save this, and I go ahead and I just create here a new variable, and I call this, let's say, clock, and I go ahead and call create clock, and I send that create clock, I'm going to basically do the exact same thing as I had before. The only difference is I have the set interval right here that is probably completely not relevant. So I'm going to go ahead and chop that out. And instead of calling update, I'm going to chop both these lines because these two lines now need to live inside of here. And even before that, I'm going to go ahead and instead of set interval, I'm just going to go ahead here and set the c.update clock because that is where my clock is. And I'm going to go ahead and force a call to my c update clock all within this construct. So again, just to look at it, we're creating a new object with the new object. I could have a shortcut here, and if I wanted to shortcut, I could just type open and close curly bracket. That would create a new object for me as well. And then I added a method in, appended to it after I created the object. I put in the same exact function that we had before, which is calling an external function, which is called format digits, which is right out here. Out of that object, I'm going ahead and calling this interval, and I'm updating the clock. Now, the big difference between this and what we did before is now it will be much easier for us to create more than one clock. And I do want to show you how. So one is right now we have your get element by ID clock. But if I go ahead into my code and I just create here a secondary clock, so I'm just going to go ahead and add another clock, and I'm just going to call it clock 2. And I save it and I go back and I click on refresh. First of all, our first clock should in theory continue working, but if it doesn't, let's see why not. Let's look at inspect element and go into our console to see what is our error. So we could see update clock is not a function. We're still calling that initial function instead of the method. So we have to go ahead and check and see what's wrong with that in line 5. And let's see if we still have that in line 5. No, I actually didn't save, and that's why we're getting that error. So I just click on the save button, click on refresh, and there we go. So first of all, we have our clock here. Beautiful. But what if we wanted to have a secondary clock? We would have absolutely no problem because literally all we need to do is add here another parameter, and we could call this, let's say, ID. And then I would just send in the clock. So I'm going to send the clock, and then I could literally just automatically send in the right ID. Now, by the way, this ID doesn't belong to the object. It belongs to this function. And because this function lives inside of this method, lives inside of this function, it will have access to that variable up here, which makes our life really easy because we could hard code these values as we go along. So literally just by creating this clock, that is clock 1, and if I wanted to, I could very easily go ahead and create a clock 2 as well, making sure that I'm sending in the ID of the second clock as well. And that easily, I've just created 2 clocks. And if I go ahead and just click on refresh, that will wrap up this lecture, and we're going to see that we have your 2 clocks running at the same time that easily in seconds. And all that was done because we wrapped up our function into an object, creating a separate object. In the next lesson, we're going to make this clock even better, not only technically as we learn a few more things in object-oriented programming, but we're also going to learn how to actually make it have different hours. What if we wanted to have one clock in a certain time zone and another clock underneath it to be in a completely different time zone? And that's exactly what we're going to look at in the next lesson. In the last lecture, we created our first object, but we're far from finished. Because one of the things that is really unique to objects is the capability to talk to ourselves. Now, when you think about it, when I'm talking inside of my head, which I do quite often, I don't say, hey Ben, how are you doing? I just ask myself, how am I doing? And that's exactly what we're going to learn about in this lesson. And by the way, this is one of the more complicated topics that you're going to find throughout the whole training in general. So we're going to start easy, but we're going to see this over and over. And really what we're talking about is something that's called scope. And in many ways, when we're talking about scope, we're talking about the question of what is this? Where are we right now? Who owns us, really? And many times that's all you have to ask yourself to be able to figure out a lot of bugs is when you see something unexpected happening, just ask yourself, who do I belong to if I was that specific line of code? And a lot of times just answering that question would solve most of your bugs. So let's go ahead, jump right in it, and meet the whole concept of scope. We created a clock in the last lesson, but really we still have a few problems, and I want to talk about one of them, and throughout this chapter we're going to solve most of the problems that we have. Now, if we go back into our code, one problem that we have is that we left our format digits as just a function that stands on its own. And we really don't want that. We want that function to be part of our clock. For one reason is, in future chapters, we're going to learn about inheritance. And with inheritance, we'll be able to create different variations of the format digits depending on what clock it is. But right now, it's completely separate from it, makes it impossible for us to create different interpretations of it. And beyond that, also adding the complexity of if you're sending this project out, then someone needs to have a lot of loose functions that should only belong to this clock. Lucky for us, the process of adding that method is very similar. We literally would just approach that object that we just created, the clock object, copy that function, just going to copy it right in there, copy that name more accurately, set the equal sign, say the word function, and we've just created a new method. Exactly that simple, and adding that semicolon to make sure that everyone knows that this line has just completed. Now, our application is not going to work just as it is right now, because if I save this and click on a refresh, we're going to see that we have a small problem. For one is it's not going to find that digital format anymore because it's not a function. But we have another secondary problem, and that is living inside of this function, inside of this method, it doesn't really have access to the object name because that object doesn't have a name when you're inside of it. Moreover than that, we're going to have a lot of functions. So how do we actually refer to another method that belongs to the same object? And that is the main topic of this lesson, and it's incredibly simple. Instead of calling format digits, I'm going to use the keywords this and then dot. By doing that, I'm basically saying to the method, I'm saying to update clock, find the format digits inside of the object itself, because this will give back whatever this object is. Doesn't really matter what the name is. And we always want to avoid calling ourselves inside of ourselves. Just think about it. It would be incredibly confusing if we would do that. Beyond the fact that it would stop us from being able to make our code dynamic. The less that we hard code things inside of our methods, the better. And in this case, just by putting the word this dot, we're basically making sure that it's going to find the method inside of the same object. Now, I'm going to do the same thing also to the format digits that is in the line below. This, well, it's in the same line, but word wrapped below, and this dot. And if I go ahead and save this and run my application one more time, it should be back to normal and back to working. So one thing that we could see that it's definitely working the first time around, but it's not working any time after that. So there was absolutely no typo. And the way I know that it worked is because right now, the right time, it showed us the current time. But every second after that it's being called, it's not, which is a perfect opportunity to talk about another thing related to scope. Because we're calling the set interval update clock, and we're calling it every 1,000 milliseconds, the first time it actually gets there after a second, this time, this one works. Because we're inside of the method, it knows what this is. But when I call the set interval, and I'm just going to put here a console.log, so we could literally see it. If I log out this, first time around, it's going to showcase itself. Second time around, it's not going to showcase itself, but instead of that, it's going to throw an error. And notice what it's actually showing. It's showing us the window itself. In other words, when I'm calling the set interval, the scope itself, what this actually means, changes. And we want to figure out a way how to undo that change. And you don't have anything to worry about it because it's quite easy, although a little bit weird. Now, the reason why it cannot find itself is very simple. When I call directly this method, and I'm calling it all the way with the full name encapsulated, I'm basically removing that method from the object and sending it to the send interval in many ways. So when the send interval is calling it again, it's calling it as a function. And when it's a function, it's not really a method. It doesn't have access to the this anymore. To solve that problem, I could create an anonymous function just by typing here function and opening and closing a bracket around it and then triggering the function from inside. Now, the idea behind this is I'm sending the function, which is just a regular function, and when that function executes, is going to call that update clock as a method. Now again, the reason why I could put here C is because we're living inside of the same function, and because we just created this object, it's going to have access to that scope forever. And it doesn't matter if we create 100 clocks, because each time it's going to be a different variable, but this function will always have access to everything that's inside of the function that is above him. Contrary to that, the keyword this is detached it's a dynamic keyword, it wouldn't find itself. So if I go ahead and I save this and I click on again and refresh my application, we should see that now our clock is also going to update and we're not going to have any issues. Now this is a very advanced topic and it's okay if it looks a little bit weird, but it should be logical. The idea behind it is this will basically give us access to whoever owns it. Now, if I go ahead and I just grab this function and just send it around, I'm going to lose the scope because I'm sending it through a set interval. So for me to enable JavaScript to know that when I'm actually calling this update clock, it's a method and not a function, I need to trigger it as a method and not as a function. And literally, I'm just wrapping a function just to help me to make sure that the set interval doesn't call this as a function, but it calls it as a method. And this is a very common workaround that you're going to see in JavaScript in general. All right, so that's it. In the next lesson, we're going to take a step deeper and walk a little bit deeper into the creation of our object, where we're going to actually go back to trying to actually put in different time zones like we talked about in the previous lesson. In the last few lessons, we created an object. We're starting to understand what scope is as well. But we haven't really done it in the object-oriented way. And don't worry, because it's a very natural progression. And what we're going to do next is we're going to explore and really realize that functions are objects. Not only are they objects, they're also the key in JavaScript to creating new objects. This is a really exciting topic. And literally, this lesson is going to be our first completely kosher object-oriented program. So let's jump ahead and see how to create a constructor. We learned about the scope, or the this, and it's really helping us because now we could add more than just one method into our function that creates our object. But I want to go back into this function that creates object, and it's not a very efficient way of doing things because really every function is a constructor as well by default if we choose for it to be that. And literally, I could have gone ahead and just set the words new, create clock, and that would be a create clock. Now, I don't have to create clock. I'll just call it clock. And a tradition in JavaScript in general, and many programming languages, functions that create things are called with an uppercase as their first character. And literally, that's all we had to do to create a new object. Now, this should still continue working, but it's not going to really do what we want it to do. Now, in general, when we're working with a constructor, then we don't need to return anything. It's by default, it's going to return itself when we create a new clock. Next thing is we don't really want to create a new object, so I'm going to go ahead and delete it. Next step after that is when we want to refer to our actual object now, we could literally just call this directly inside of it because we're already inside of that clock, whatever its name will be. So instead of referring to C, I'm going to go ahead and refer to this. And that's all I really had to do. And I'm just going to go ahead here and type here this as well. And that's all I really had to do. Oh, one more. This. Literally calling itself because I don't need to do anything beyond that. And the this that is inside of this function is a method that belongs to our object. So that this would be the same thing. So everything should continue working. If I go ahead and save this, go back into my application and click on refresh, we should see that everything should basically do the exact same thing as it did before, besides a small problem that we have inside of our update clock. Now, the update clock problem that we have now is again a question of scope. If we go back into our application and try to figure out why are we getting this problem, first of all, it's loading the first time around without any problem when we're referring to the this. But with all the changes that we just did as we turn this into a constructor, the this inside of this function gets lost again. And if I go ahead and I just put here a little console.log to see what is this actually when we're inside of the timer, we're going to get a very interesting result. And by the way, I want to also get rid of that console here because we don't need it anymore. Oh, actually, we could see that console already. We don't even need to trace it. We could look at it. So we could see that first of all is that we're in the beginning, we're getting the object. Right after that, it's telling us this.update clock is not a function at all. And not a function at all basically means is that when we're trying to trace this right here, and I'm going to get rid of that, it's basically saying that this doesn't exist. There is no such thing as this inside of this function at this stage. If I go ahead and click on refresh here, we're going to see that there is no, we're missing an attribute line 32. Let me just fix that. Why line 32? I must have not closed something when I deleted that last line, but let me just double check. Double check. Okay, let me just save this. In my set interval, oh, I'm not closing my set interval because I did here a comma. So I'm just gonna go ahead here and close it from here to here, save it, go back and click on refresh. And when we click on refresh, we're gonna see the first time around it worked. Second time around, it's giving us back the window when we're setting the this. So obviously that is not what we want. Now, what we really want is for us to refer back to the actual object itself. And there's a trickery with scope that you could do that you'll find yourself needing a lot of times to do is when you want to refer to something, this that doesn't exist anymore, but this element does have access still to everything inside of this function. Because if I go ahead here and I do a console.log just for the ID itself, you're going to see something really interesting. So I'm just going to comment that out again. You're going to see something interesting because it's going to see that ID even though it cannot see the this. So if I click here, you're going to see that I am seeing the ID of whatever is coming through. So what I could do is take advantage of the fact that I have access to the object still, but I don't have access to the this by literally just creating here a quick little workaround variable. I'm going to call it that. Going to set it to the value of this, which exists. And now I could go ahead and say, hey, I want you to display that instead of displaying the word this, really creating a workaround variable. Once I created that workaround variable and I click on refresh, we're going to see that now we're going to have access to the object again. Now, object-oriented programming, this is really the most complicated topic in object-oriented programming. Once you get scope and you find your bugs and you figure out how to always to refer to who you are, all the rest is incredibly easy. So now that we saw how to fix that problem of having a lost scope, I could go ahead here and again within that timer call, instead of this, call that. And that is a variable that we created. We're referring to the this while we're in line 25 when we still have access to the object itself. We still have access to the actual this. And then we're basically creating a variable that has a global scope for this method, this function, and this function will have access to that, but it just doesn't have access to this anymore once we created that change and turned our variable into a constructor. So there you go. And if I go ahead and save this, our clock should be back running, ticking. And the concept that we just learned right now is one we enhanced our scope understanding. And I think that is it for the topic of scope in general. But it's definitely something that you're going to confront a lot as an object-oriented programmer. So I thought, let's put it all the way in the beginning. You're going to confront the biggest challenge, but it's not too bad. You can see how to work around and just always go back to this chapter's videos anytime you get stuck with an issue of scope, and you should more or less have a solution to all issues related to scope. Always just keep these videos really nearby because they're going to help you a lot throughout your object-oriented career. Now that we're done with creating a constructor, we want to move on to actually a new chapter. And a new chapter will add that extra configuration of enabling us to have clocks with different time zones. And that's exactly what we're going to do in the next lesson, which will be the last lesson that wraps up this chapter. So we're going to see you in the next lesson when we wrap up this topic. In the last lesson, we created a traditional object-oriented object in JavaScript with a constructor, which we saw was basically a function that we added to it the word new before creating a new object. In this lesson, we're going to wrap up this topic with a bit of a rehearsal as we create a digital clock that has different faces, or basically different clocks, enabling us to add a clock in a certain time zone and another clock in a completely different time zone to run at the same time. So let's do it. Before we wrap up really this topic of creating objects and moving on to more advanced topics of object-oriented programming, we owe you something. We owe you turning this clock into two different time zones. Now, JavaScript by default has only two different time zones. One time zone is the actual user's time zone, and the other is the UTC time. There are no other options, and you could create your own custom variations of it, but then you have to account to time saving and different hours that change during different dates, and you'd have to create a relatively more complex application. For us, what we're going to do is we're going to create the UTC clock as the main clock, and we're going to have my New York time as the bottom clock. Now, to do that, what I want to do is I want to basically figure out what is the UTC time. Now, the UTC time, and I have a few ways of doing this, and I want to do it the more complicated way because I want to show you how to control the time zones yourself if you want to create a local time zone that is not the time zone of your computer. Now, the steps involved are not that complicated, and I want to just go ahead here and I'm just going to comment out all our creation of clocks for a second so we could dig a little bit deeper into the date object. I'm going to go ahead here and create a new date object. Now, by default, the date object is basically creating the date that is currently right now, and it's adding into it the offset of the user. Now, if I wanted to know what that offset is, I could literally just go to my console log and just ask for that get time zone offset. And by doing that, I'm going to basically get the user's time zone offset. In my case, because I'm in New York, that would be 5 hours right now, which is exactly 300 seconds. Seconds? Yeah. Or minutes. No, it's 300 minutes, right? So 300 minutes, because if we take 300 minutes and divide them by 60, then we would get their 5, which is 5 hours. So that's it. So our offset, we're getting that in minutes, but what we really want to get is we want to get it actually in milliseconds. So I'm going to duplicate it by 60 to turn my minutes into seconds, time it by another 1000 to turn that into milliseconds. Now, the idea behind this is very simple. What I want to do is I want to create a completely new watch and literally send in this offset to that clock, adding in our offset, because this value, because we're minus 5 hours, this value is basically the amount of time gap that you need to remove or add into your current time of your time zone to get to the UTC. So if I go ahead and I just take this value and I add to it the current time in milliseconds from midnight in 1970, don't ask me why, literally all I got to do is just get my date and add to it the get time, which is basically the amount of milliseconds, as I said, from midnight a million gazillion years ago. In 1970 at midnight is just a date. I don't really know why, but it is a date that is the one that is used. Now I could go ahead and just create here a new date and send in this information to it, literally telling him, hey, add this offset. Basically, we're adding that offset, creating a new clock. Now, if we just go ahead and try to run this application, and I'm just going to run this and just do a console.log and just trace out my date, we're going to get date offset again. It's going to have the offset. So the value itself, we're going to fake a UTC as we're inside of a New York time zone because we're basically force adding the UTC time into it because there is no such thing as a clock that is running on UTC in JavaScript. Every clock is running on the local user's time. So what I'm doing is I'm basically appending more time onto it, changing the time, pushing our time locally in that local zone and adding a few hours into that time zone. So now that I know how to create this, I'm just going to save this and go back into my application. Instead of seeing here the time, which is right now is 5 in the morning, I would get a time, which is the UTC time, which is more closer to, what time is it right now, UTC? 3 p.m., something like that. All right, so now the next step is really what we want to do is, first of all, I want to basically move this logic of offset and start adding it into our clock. So I'm going to create an offset property. And the first thing I want to do with my offset property is make sure that there is a value there, because the user might have not even set anything, or in our case, we didn't set anything. So what I'm basically doing is I'm saying if any value that is not valid, such as null and 0 and undefined, so send 0 instead. If the value is a numeric value, really in this case, if there is a value that's coming through, then just send it as that value. So now that we know what that offset is, the next step that I really want to do is I want to create a variable here that will be stored inside of this object that will store for me the amount of offset I need to add into our call. So for amount of offset that we want to call, I'm going to call this offset, and notice how I have your offset, which is a global variable, and I have the this.offset, which is the personal variable of this object. I'm going to go ahead here and just copy the time zone itself. So to do that, I'm going to basically copy all these lines here, and I'm just going to paste them right inside here, because this is my helper. And I'm just going to make sure that instead of setting it into a new object, I'm just going to go ahead and just store this offset. And I also want to take into account the actual offset that the user is requesting for. So I'm going to go ahead here and also just going to wrap this in a bracket. And I'm just going to take our offset that the user is sending, add it to the offset that we already have by default, and then duplicate and get all those values that I wanted to get. I'm not going to do a new date here because we're going to do that as we refresh. But this information does not need to be refreshed. This offset is constant. This is the offset that we always want. And last but not least is we want to make sure that for our date object, when we're actually creating the date object itself, that we are going to do a two-step tier just like we did previously, and then go to our date object and basically recreate it again right after that and add that new offset into it. So I'm going to go ahead here and create a new date again. And into that, I'm going to send basically this offset that we were creating plus the actual time that the machine is telling me that it is. So I'm going to go ahead there and just add to it also that date.getTime. And there we go. And I come to you from the future. I wanted to correct a mistake that I made. And the mistake that I made was very simple. Although everything is going to work in a second when we go to play things. The reason it's working is because we're actually doing the exact same thing that we had before. We're not very efficient, are we? Because we're using our old offset, the global offset or the functions offset, and not the objects offset that is saving all this information. So to make this example really efficient, I would have to go ahead and grab our this.offset, and instead of actually calculating that time zone offset and doing all this process, doing these 1, 2, 3, 4 actions, I would replace it with the this.offset. Now, because this was already recorded and we're doing it in the future, then you're going to see the not very efficient, but it will still work. And in the following chapter, we're going to revisit that and fix it. So let's get back to it. All this logic should now help us create, and if we go ahead here and just run this one more time, and I'm going to save this information and go back and run our application, I'm going to have your clock number 1, which is going to be 10 in the morning. Okay, that makes more sense because it's 5 in New York and we're 5 hours apart. And we'll have 10 on the bottom. But what I could do now that I know that there is this offset and I could add it in, I could literally just add here an extra parameter. And in this extra parameter, I could send in, for example, how about minus 300 for the offset of the time that we want it to have. And if I go ahead here and just click on refresh, now we're going to have UTC time on the top and New York time on the bottom. All I really would probably want to add in here is maybe another extra copy. So let's go ahead and do that. And I'm going to add here an extra copy. And this extra copy will be basically, let's call this ETC for Eastern Time Clock. Right, ETC. And then I'm going to call here label. And all that's left for me to do is also go into my formatting that is going on right here. And after I'm adding all that information, to go ahead and add a little bit more, such as the label itself. And I'm going to also make sure that there's a space in between here. And if I do that, I'm going to, first of all, again, by default, I'm going to have your value that is undefined because I'm not sending it on the top. So I would get here an undefined as well, which I really don't want. In a case where there is nothing, I could literally or say I want to turn it by default to be UTC. Or by default, I want to put nothing in it. So if label doesn't have anything inside of it, I could literally say, hey, put nothing inside. Or I could say, hey, just put here UTC. And if I go ahead and save this, now I'm going to have one clock with the UTC. And in my case, it's kind of breaking a line and I would probably want to change the layout. So, or in our case, I could just say, hey, for the main clock, in our case, unless we change the design and make it a little bit smaller, then we're not going to put anything. But for our lower clock, we're going to say what is the time zone of that lower clock. And that's it. We've just created a 2-phase clock, which could very easily turn into a 3-phase clock, because if we wanted to, we could literally just go ahead and add a third clock if we wanted to, and add another time zone if we wanted to, even though I can't even think about what other time zone it would be, but I could literally just go ahead and literally milliseconds, go ahead and add another clock, and this time around, let's do this 300, so it'll be a different value, and I'll just call this X for that other country that it is, because I don't know what country it would be. And I'm going to click here on refresh, and we can see that now we have your 3 different clocks that are running in the exact same time. And you can have as many of them as you want. And this is how we wrap up this chapter. It is our first steps in object-oriented programming. And in other words, our code isn't completely efficient. And I want to tell you what is the biggest problems of our code. And one of our biggest problems in our code right now is that we're creating a completely new date twice every single second. And not only we're doing that for 1 clock, we're doing it for 3 clocks. So as you build your applications more and more and more, this update clock that is happening every second is doing quite a lot of stuff. And the less it does, the better. For example, it's getting the hours, it's getting the minutes, it's getting the seconds, but are the hours really changing? No, these hours only change once an hour, so why are we updating it more often? And these are issues that we're going to basically face and try to fix when we move to the next chapter to improve our clock and add more functionality to it and make it better. Now, these steps are really important because as you start building bigger and bigger applications, the more efficient your code is, especially in places that are repetitive, then the better and smoother your code will run. And with that, we wrap up this chapter, and that's a teaser for what we're going to start talking about in the next chapter as we expand deeper into the world of object-oriented programming. In the last lecture, which was in the last chapter, we completed building a digital clock that could be customizable to have different faces, basically having different clocks running at the same time. But one of our problems in our construction in that stage was that everything was inside of our constructor. Now, you might not think yet that that's an issue, but it is, because as we progress into the next chapter as well, we're going to want to be able to create inheritance, which basically means having something that could override our methods. And to do that, we really need to be able to make those methods really belong to be part of that function, part of that constructor. To do that, we're going to use a property that's called prototype. And in many ways, if you've worked in other languages, it's kind of like private and public, but not really. The most important thing that we're going to get out of this lesson is we're going to revisit the functions, methods really that we've created and take them out of our constructor. And that's going to help us throughout the remainder of this chapter and the chapters to come. So let's jump into it and see how we do that. Already right now, you could pride yourself in saying that you know how to build object-oriented programming, objects in general. But our problem with our object right now, as we said as we finished the last chapter, that it's not really efficient. And we want to make it more efficient. And one of the problems with the efficiencies of the clock is that all the methods are built right into the clock itself directly, making it impossible for us, if we want to in the future, expand this clock and basically connect it to be inherited. So if we want to create an alarm clock later on, it would be really hard for us because all the functionality of this clock is locked in. And really that is going to be one of our main topics. So to be able to do that, the first step that we have to do is we have to remove these methods from within the actual constructor itself and move it to stand alone on their own. But if we just create it this way, it's not really going to work. Although, if I just go ahead and copy the name of the object itself that we're bound to create and add that clock name instead of this, it will come back and work. But we're going to have a few issues. So if I go ahead and save, one of the issues is that when we try to call the update clock, among a few other issues, this function doesn't exist inside of the constructor because only after the constructor is completed, then the reference to update clock and format digits gets created. So if I go ahead here and just even comment out all this stuff, and let me show you that there is an error before to make sure that you're with me and agree with me. So if I go ahead here and I'm just going to drop in chapter 3 into our HTML page, and I'm just going to grab it, chapter 3, and you'll see that we're getting an error. First of all, it's just not finding update clock. So I'm going to go ahead and just comment out all this update clock logic for a second. And don't worry, we're going to solve this problem soon. And I want to show you that if I just go ahead to any of the clocks and I try to check and see, do you, Mr. Clock, have the method format digits? The specific clock, even clock 3 for that matter. If I go ahead and try to see, do you have this method? The answer that is going to come back is going to be very, very clear. No, it doesn't. And you might ask yourself, why doesn't it have that object? And the answer is very simple, is because the only item that actually owns this function that only exists is actually the clock itself. So if I go ahead and I just try to approach the actual clock constructor and say, hey, Mr. Clock, do you have this digital format? And if we click on save and go there and we click on refresh, we're going to see that that function is owned by that actual object constructor. And that is why we don't have access to it at all. But that's not what we really want to happen. What we want to happen is that whenever a new constructor, a new object is being created, that it will automatically duplicate itself into that item. Now, to do that, once we're outside of the constructor, we can't just approach the this anymore because there is no this outside. And we have to basically type clock, the name of the object that is, dot prototype, dot whatever function name we want. I'm going to go ahead and do that also for the secondary item. And once we do that, we will have now reference and access to the item. But that's not enough, because now that we have reference and access to the item itself, and it does have access even in the constructor zone itself, the access itself is not going to be good enough because we have here a lot of variables that we're referring to, such as this offset construction, the different variables that we're going to see. So if I just go ahead here and I just even save it, click on refresh and just follow the errors, we'll see that first of all, we're not actually, we didn't save. So let me just go ahead and save here, go back and click on refresh and just follow the errors. We'll see, okay, error number 1, offset is not defined. Why is offset not defined? Because I actually didn't update that offset here. I'm still using that offset that we were hard coding, using that property that was coming through the constructor. But that variable doesn't exist once we're outside of that scope of that method. So to gain access to the variable that I actually want, I'm going to use the word this and then offset, which will give me access to this offset. Let's continue. So besides that problem, we have also a problem of the ID itself, which we don't have access to. So to gain access to it, I'm going to go ahead and create access, create a new property, and set that property to be the value of the variable that's being sent in. And now that I have access to it, I could literally just go ahead and say, hey, this.id, get me this.id. So let's see if there's any other variables that are not in scope. And we see we have a little error here on line 26. So I'm going to go ahead to line 26 and see what did I do wrong here. I added here an extra open bracket, which is not good. And by the way, it didn't give me exactly the line of the error, but that's fine because it gave me the scope of the zone itself, and I knew that I did work on here. So it was really easy to find and fix. So we're going to click on refresh, and the next item is label that isn't defined. So we're going to go ahead and add label into our object as well. Now you might think to yourself, well, this is a lot more code. Why would I actually want to do this? And let me turn on, for some reason, my word wrap got turned off again. And I'm going to go ahead here and just set this.label, save it. And let's see if there's any other errors. I believe that would do it. And now all of our object is running and everything is back to working the way we would want it to work. Now, before we dive deeper into the world of prototypes, which is an amazing world on its own, I want to go back into our object here and figure out a way how to make it more efficient. Because calling the new date object every single round is very not efficient. And we are going to find a better way of approaching it in the next lecture as we learn a little bit about new things. So we'll see in the next lecture when we learn about new things. What we just did in our last lesson was we went to the object that we created, our clock, and we went to it, added to it methods directly to the clock itself, saying, hey, Mr. Clock, you also have a few more properties in your prototype. Properties or methods. Now again, the difference between a property and a variable is that a property belongs to an object, a variable doesn't. The difference between a method and a function is that a function is loose, while a method belongs to a specific object. In this lesson, now that we could see this relationship and we could add methods to any object, we could also add it to any built-in object as well. And that's exactly what we're going to do in this lesson when we go to our actual date object and add more features to it to make our clock more efficient. So let's see it. For a while, I've been telling you that putting in the update clock that happens every single second to call a new date every single time is really not efficient. And nor is calling all these methods. And that's exactly what we're going to solve now. Now that we know what the prototype is, I want to teach you about something really cool a prototype could do. It could literally add functions to existing pre-built things as well. So even the date object, wouldn't it be lovely if we had a method inside of the date object that could basically automatically, and I'm just going to go ahead here and create here a date, automatically, whenever we call it, update the seconds in 1 second. Prototype, and I'm going to call this update seconds, and all that's left for me is to create a function just like we did with our clock itself, and I've just added a new function to the date object. And what do I want to do with it? I want to basically say this.setSeconds. I want to change the seconds. That's one of the properties of the date object. And how am I going to change it? I'm going to get the seconds plus 1. Now, that's all I really have to do to really make this date object a lot more smart and not need to worry about creating these offsets over and over. So what I'm going to do is I'm basically going to create the date, create the offset itself directly. I don't even have to save the offset anymore. I could if I want to. But the next step is what I want to do is I want to create the date and then send into the date the new date, which will account also for the offset. So I could literally create a local variable here for offset because we're not going to use it anymore up here. And last but not least, go ahead and add a new property. And I'm going to call this, let's say, D for date, which will be the global variable for the date itself. And I'll create here a new date, sending inside of it the actual offset logic, which we have right here, which is basically offset plus the actual get time. I'm literally copying it from right here. And that's all I had to do to create that initial object. And if I go ahead here and I just get rid of all of this, and instead of it just refer to my object, we'll see that everything should be still working, but it's just not going to tick anymore if we don't have any errors. So let's see this. If I click on refresh, we should see the actual time, but it's going to freeze in time and not move any further. The last thing that's left for us to do is literally every time we update the clock to basically go to the date itself and say, by the way, and I'm just referring to it, I could refer to it any state, basically call the update seconds. And if I save this and click on refresh, we should have here a refreshed view of our date. And it will automatically, when it reaches, actually this is one of the cool features, if you send in 61 seconds into the seconds of JavaScript, it will automatically push up the amount of minutes. And we don't even have to worry about that logic anymore. And there you go. We've just created a much smarter application by adding more functionality to the built-in methods. And now we don't have to update the date itself internally. And if we really wanted to, we could have made this logic even more interesting by literally going inside of our update seconds and maybe even adding an extra functionality such as date prototype.autoclock. And I could set my auto clock and I'll set here a function and it'll have as is auto. And we could go ahead here and say if is auto, then we want to, what do we want to do? We want to go to this and we're going to add a new property to this. And I'm going to call this property, let's say this dot interval. So I'll call this even clock interval. And I'm going to set a new interval, set interval. And I'm going to set my interval to basically go ahead and call the update seconds every X amount of time. So literally, I'm just going to process this by creating a new variable here, call it that, create a reference to this. So I could then create here an anonymous function. And in that anonymous function, call that dot update seconds. And last but not least, make sure that I'm setting it to every 1 second to be called. And literally what I'm doing here is I'm creating a clock that will automatically count. And once I've done that, really all that's left for me to do is to call that auto and also make sure that if someone is calling it more than once, that it's not going to actually trigger more than once. So I could literally just also make sure that I do a clear interval, which will make sure that if this variable exists, then it's fine to send nothing into clear interval. It wouldn't generate any errors. And what that would do is it automatically clear the interval. Now, even better than that, I could take this function and push it right away up here. So the first thing I do anytime this function is called is I clear the interval. That way, if it's called 100 times, it's completely fine. We're clearing the interval each time. And anytime I want to re-trigger it and restart it, I just have to set it to true. And automatically, when I set it to true, it should automatically work. And if I save this, go back into my application, and this time around, not call the update seconds at all, but instead of that, right after I create my object here, my date object, my final date object, I could go to this dot D and call the auto clock. And by calling the auto clock, I'm going to create an interval that will run once a second and run our clock and update it automatically. And all we're really doing is refreshing the view. So if I go ahead here and click on refresh, we should get again a clock that is ticking without any problem. Although we do have a problem. And what is our problem? What is our problem? Oh, is that we're not actually sending true. We want to send it to be true. So let's go ahead there, send it to true. Refresh it one more time. And here we go. We got a clock that is ticking without any problem. And we don't even have to tell it to update. We have a clock that will automatically update itself once a second. And that's how we added in an extra built-in functionality to the date object without needing to create a clock of our own, really. We're leveraging the date itself to enhance the clock. And then all we have here is just a face for a clock that's showing our clock in different ways. And that is it. for this lecture at least. See you in the next one where we continue digging into the world of prototypes in JavaScript. I wanted to talk about something just in general. Throughout this training and throughout this course, I've been avoiding using some keywords because I don't want you to get confused in the process of learning object-oriented programming in JavaScript, which is completely different than a lot of other languages. Now, you will see in a lot of documentation about object-oriented programming in general, the word classes. And what classes do is basically it's like blueprints that enable you to duplicate things. Those don't really exist in JavaScript, but instead of that, we have functions in JavaScript that create objects. But really, there is something very similar to a blueprint, which is actually whenever you're not inside of an object and you're inside of the definer area of the place that creates objects versus the place that is the object. So it's very similar to a class if you've heard about classes. In this lesson, we're going to go back into our code and see the difference between them because we're going to talk about something really interesting. It's static variables. Static variables are variables that belong to that constructor itself that never get passed on to the object. It's literally a variable that would then be approachable from anywhere because it's going to be a variable that's going to be owned by the actual object itself. A very common static variables and methods that you'll see is the math class or the math object really. Because you never create a new math object, but you go to the math class or object, whatever you want to call it, and you approach its methods. And that's exactly what we're going to do with our date object class. It's kind of like a pun to say class, but the creator of date. And we're going to go to that date creator and say, hey, here's a few methods and properties we want you to own, the creator itself. But don't pass it on to your children, to your creations more accurately. All right, so let's see it in action, and let's see why is that incredibly useful in some situations. So we're continuing in our hunt for efficiency, and the next step in our efficiency that we want to talk about as we expand into a new topic, which is static variables and static methods and properties in general. And I'm going to go back to the date object really soon, but I want to talk about a couple of more things. So far we added only methods, but not directly properties. But we could also very easily go to our clock and define properties by just going to the clock, prototype, and then right here whatever variable we want. For example, let's set it to be version. And I'll set my version to be 1.0. So I'm going to set this to 1.0, and that will be my version. Once I set that, I could refer back to it at any stage also within my application. I don't have to only create the variables in the constructor itself. So if I wanted to, in my update clock, I could go ahead and just set here a console.log and get access to my versions in the exact same way by setting this in the beginning and then the variable name. If I save this, go back into my application, click on refresh, we're going to see my version number updating once a second. Beautiful. Now, that's not the main topic of this lesson. What I want to do is I want to continue talking about efficiency. Now, right now, everything is really running well. Our only few problems that we have are very few. One of them is that we're updating our clock ourselves. Well, not anymore because we're using a set interval. But our problem is that we're creating a set interval and we have the set interval basically happen automatically on our own inside here, basically saying that we have 3 intervals that are running. If I had here 100 different items that once a second were updating, I would have 100 functions being called, and that's not an incredibly efficient way of usage of our logic. So wouldn't it be wonderful if we had a way, by the way, beyond that, we also have another 3 intervals right here because every single new clock we create will have an interval. So let's start with the date itself and find a way to make it more efficient. What I really want to have is have only one item, one interval, and not more than one interval that runs. Through that one interval, call all the clocks whenever they're needed. Now, the way I could do that is when I create a variable or a method or a property or method, and I set it directly to the date object uppercase as the date itself is written, I'm creating a static variable that belongs, or static method, or static functions, or static whatever you want to call it, that belongs to the date object. So for example, I could create here an add to interval. All right, so add to interval, which will accept the date because it's going to be a date that will be sent through to it. And I'm going to just go ahead and create it, function, It is going to accept a date. And what do we want to do here? So really, one thing that I want to do inside of this date thing is I'm going to go ahead and create here a secondary variable for my date. And I'm going to call this, I'm going to put your underscore to make sure this is not really a public variable, to make it clear that it's not something that users should be able to access in general. It's going to call this interval, and that's going to be our date interval itself. By default, I'm just going to set it to 0. I'm going to go ahead to my interval. I'm going to go ahead and add another property, which is going to be let's call this a dates. And this one by default is going to have the value of an array. So now I'm adding here a little bit of extra variables that belong to the date object itself. Now, I want to check something out. So if I go ahead and I just call that date add interval, and I could call it anywhere as long as I approach the fully named construct, and I go ahead here and I do a console.log, you're going to see that the this is going to be a very, very unexpected behavior because there is no this when we're inside of that date. So if I go ahead and I just run this, and this is going to happen once a second, and I go ahead here and just run it for a second, we're going to see when that second passes, it's going to basically return to us the constructor itself and not actually an item directly. And knowing that this is our scope that we're in the constructor itself, we could very easily test out and see, could we have access to the interval directly? And if I just press that right in there, add it, save it, and refresh it, we'll see that we won't have direct access to it because we have access to the actual date itself, but that doesn't mean, so I could go ahead and say this dot interval if I wanted to, but that would be quite confusing, but it's probably very logical. And the this here is going to be completely different than the this here, because the this here is the actual object that is being created, and the this here is the actual class itself, the prototype, the thing that with it we create objects. So if I go ahead and I save this and I click on refresh, this time around we're going to see that variable will come through, and the this itself is the actual date itself. Contrary to that, if I try to add here another console.log and I try to get the this.interval directly from the object that supposedly was created, it's not going to work. The only way for me to approach it would be to set that hard code the value date in here to gain access to it. So if I set here this and I just try to run it, we'll see that that one is going to come back as undefined. But if I wanted to get access to it, I would have to type here date, making sure that I have a pathway and access into it, and then it wouldn't come back as undefined anymore. All right? With that said, let me just comment this out, and we'll continue with our exercise. So whenever we add to interval, what I really want to do is I basically want to go ahead here and I want to basically add it into our array. So I'm going to go ahead here and just add it to that constructors array. And I'm just going to push into it that date itself, which basically will mean that now this thing will automatically update. And I'm going to ask here a very simple question. If there is no interval, if one was not created yet, then we want to create one. And in that case, I'm going to go ahead and create a new interval by setting a set interval. And I'm going to call that set interval, and I'm just going to call it one of those properties of the date. And let me set it, for example, we're going to call this, I'm going to go ahead and just create that variable that method 1 second. We're going to call it date.update dates. And update dates is going to be a function. It's not going to take anything into it. And right here, we're going to do the logic of updating all the date elements. So time for us to actually call that date object. And again, because we want to keep the scope that we're in, I'm going to go ahead and use the function, the anonymous function. I'm going to go ahead and call the this from within it, or even directly the date.update dates. That way I'm making sure that I'm keeping reference to that date and I'm not going to lose scope if I send the method just loosely on its own. I'm going to have that update once a second. So that's the logic that basically checked if I didn't have an interval, I'm creating an interval, and this creation will only happen once. So if I go ahead here and I add here a console.log, and I'm just going to log out the length of our date. So I'm going to go here and the length of our A dates. What I'm going to get back is the amount of dates that I've added in. And I'm just going to go out here and just add your length. And I'm going to save it. And last thing that's left for me to do is to add to interval. And the interval will only be created once, but the items will always be pushed in. So all that's left for me to do is in my auto clock, what I want to do is if is auto, I'm going to go ahead here and just comment this out. We're not going to create an interval, but instead of that, we're going to go in and send into that date interval, into that set date method to add interval, the object itself that we're in. Now, we're not going to create a clear interval because this is going to be a one-time kind of thing theoretically. And we're going to look at in the next session, how do we test this out and fix it and make sure that we can't call the same add twice, or how do we remove an item after it's been added in? But we're going to look at that in the next lesson. First of all, we want to see that this is working, and we are already configuring and we're adding that auto to our clock, auto clock right here, to every single clock that we create. So if I go ahead and save this, theoretically, everything should continue working as it did before. So if I go ahead and I click on refresh here, then our clock should continue working. We have here a slight little snag. We have to figure out what is the snag. Oh, well, we just needed to get the console. So if we look at our trace itself, first of all, the first step that we want to do is we want to try to figure out why isn't that trace happening. So first of all, our interval here, if it's not, then really then it will forever be not. And actually we want to say here if it's not set, because if there is a number there, it was set already. And if it's nothing, then it's staying nothing forever. So that was our mistake right there. But basically, because it's 0 forever until we set it for the first time. So not 0 equals true, then it will go in. But once there is a value there, it will always be false, and then it wouldn't run. So if we run this just one more time, we should see that we get here that we have here 3 items that are stored in. All that's left for us to do is inside of our update dates is to loop through those items. And I'm just going to go ahead there and create a new var I equals 0, loop through this dot adence length. So it's, as long as I is smaller than the length itself, that was bigger. So as long as I is smaller than the length itself, then we're going to upgrade the I each time. And all that's left for us to do is to actually trigger the actual function that updates the seconds, which is the update seconds. So all I have to do is just call this dot update seconds, and that should give us everything we need to have our clock ticking again. So if I go ahead here and click on refresh, we should see that now we have here our clock, and we have a small little issue, so we have to resort to fixing. If we come back in here, I by mistake wrote here this instead of approaching my actual A dates. So I'm going to go here, this dot the object with my dates, and then refer to each item in each round, save it, and now we should have a clock that is operational. Almost. All right, so we're definitely getting closer. So let's see what is our problem. First of all, you can see that the clock is ticking, so that's a good sign. That means that all the clocks are ticking, so that's a really good sign, and it just means that we're counting probably a bit too much. That is telling me that there must be another call somewhere, because if there wasn't another call, the clock wouldn't be ticking, which it is, but we're still getting that error, which basically tells me that I have here basically a function that I by mistake pasted here, which I didn't intend to put it there. So I could go ahead and delete that because that was a function that was never meant to be there. So if I save that and remove it, because we're really putting that in only when we're turning the auto clock on, if I go ahead and save that and run my application again, then we won't get that error anymore. And that's it. We just learned how to create static properties and methods, and we also looked at the difference between using the prototype and not using the prototype, both for properties and methods. In the next lecture, we're going to solve a problem that is very common. And that problem is, what do you do when your library starts to grow and you're starting to work with other libraries, but have a fear that the names in your library might match the names of other libraries? How do you protect yourself to make sure that you're not going to compete with other resources? Now, the way we're going to solve that is using something that's called namespaces, and that is going to be the topic of our next lecture. At this stage, you know how to create objects and how to work with them. You know how to create constructors. You know what scope is. You know the difference between static variables and methods and non-static ones. The next step that we want to talk about is, how do you protect what you're creating? When you think about it, there's a lot of applications that have hundreds of methods, and a lot of times you're going to use third-party tools to integrate into your application. How do you avoid scenarios where the function that you created already exists by another platform that you're working with and creating an issue and creating an irregular functionality when working? The way to avoid that is using something that's called namespaces. And although the name sounds really crazy scary, it's very simple. The idea behind it is to hide your code into a unique name that no one else would use. A very common methodology is to actually use your domain name. So in our case, we're going to use our domain name, which is 0togeek.com, but we're only going to switch it around, making it to the com.o2geek. So let's see it in action and see, because basically no one would ever use that combination because no one owns our domain besides us. Let's see it in action. I wanted to do something that's not very visual and relatively simple. In a lot of programming languages, there is the concept of namespaces. And the idea behind a namespace is to try to prevent a situation where I'm creating something such as clock, which could be very generic, with another platform. What if jQuery, if we had jQuery loaded up, what if jQuery had also a clock method, a clock object? Then we would have here a conflict between those objects and we would have an unexpected behavior. Wouldn't it be great if there was some sort of a way to create new clock objects, but have them not sit on top of the global scope, but sit in a place with a namespace? And there sure is. Now, the process of creating a namespace is very simple. Now, the first step that we want to do is we're going to create a basic object. And our basic object, what we want to do is I'm setting a namespace is the name of your actual site. So for example, my site is 0.geek.com. And then the name of your projects. And we do it the way opposite. So com.0togeek.project name. In our case, it's going to be just the clock. But 0 is not a legal character, so I'm going to go to O2Geek. And notice how the package name itself, which is what we call it, the package name itself is all lowercase, but the project, the class itself, is uppercase. So let's see how we create that. So I'm going to go ahead and literally just create the com variable. But what if it already exists, such as maybe someone else is creating a namespace as well? And if we just set here a new object, it's going to automatically override their object, which is not what we want to do. So literally all we really have to do is ask, do you exist? And if you don't exist, then create an object. This will make sure that when we're creating this new com folder, it's not going to override an existing one. The next step is I want to go to the com folder and I want to create the O2Geek. And again, I might be creating here a file, a structure that I already have. So maybe I have a few different files that I'm adding in at the same time. So I'm going to do the exact same construct, asking, does the file ogeek exist? If it does, then just send that into that variable. And if not, we're just going to create a new object again. Last but not least, now that we have our construct ready, we're ready to revisit our clock method and switch around our logic. Instead of, basically, we're going to go to the file, just like we did when we were inside of the actual function itself, when we were inside of the constructor a while back ago. I'm setting first the full qualified name of our method, and then I'm wrapping it around. And we still have here a constructor that belongs to this object. Now, same applies to all the different properties. Now I have to refer to them with their fully qualified names. So if I go ahead here and I just update it and I send in the fully qualified names for all of the methods of our methods and properties of our clock, now we have here our clock. In the future, anytime that we want to actually create a new clock, for example, up here when we're creating a clock, we're going to have to literally put the full qualified name, and we're going to ask to create a new full path to that full construct. And there we go. We've just created our first package. And if you try and make sure that you always put your things inside of your domain's package, you're going to avoid and make it impossible for other people to by mistake override your code, because they would probably first have to put your domain name and only after that the actual project name. And if you're planning on having a lot of projects, you could create even subdomains inside of there. So there we go. And if I go ahead and I click on refresh and my clock should do the exact same thing. It should still tick. Nothing should change in it. And now you also know how to create namespaces, which is really, really helpful as you start building a lot of different objects and you don't want your objects to override each other or have a scenario where someone else's objects might interfere with yours. And that's it. We are done with this chapter. In the next chapter, we're going to dive even deeper into the world of prototypes as we learn about object-oriented programming's inheritance and how do you get and enhance and build an object that expands an object that already exists. And we're going to look into that in the next chapter. So see you then. We're getting very close to the end of this course. We're in chapter 4 already. And in this chapter, we're diving way deeper into the world of objects and how they work. And we're going to start it off talking about functions. And functions is not only a function. As we said, functions in many ways, they're much more than that because we could add to them prototypes, we could add to them static variables. And really, a function is actually a type of object. Not only is it a type of object, it also has a few built-in functions of its own. And we're going to look at them right now because we're going to need them for the remainder of the course in a lot of situations. So let's meet the functions. So far, one of the main goals in this chapter is to walk away from us adding and changing and manipulating directly the built-in object. In a real world, we love these features, but we wouldn't want them to be part of the built-in object, but we would want to probably extend the object. For example, we might want to have an object that is called live date. And maybe live date would be an object that would basically do all these functionalities that are inside of our date object. But we have a problem. And one problem, and not really a problem, beyond a problem, we have a conception that we have to break through. So far throughout your career as a developer, you probably treated functions as just functions because that's what they were. In JavaScript, that's not the case. Functions, just as is, are objects. And I can prove it to you very easily. If I go ahead here and I'm just going to show you, for example, this object expects to get 2 properties, or maybe 3 properties even, ABC. I'm going to go ahead and have it console out into the log those variables. Now if I go ahead here and I just call this function liveDate, not even creating a new object, literally just going ahead and calling liveDate, and I literally just go ahead and send, let's say 1, 2, 3. Fine, that's a function, everything is working, it's behaving exactly as a function behaves, we're expecting it to be a function. Now let's see something really cool. Now I'm going to go ahead here and also trace out and also console out what this is. What is this at all? And if I go ahead and I refresh our view and I ask us what it is, it's going to tell us it's the view. We're not inside of a specific object really, so we're in the window itself. I could literally go ahead and say, I don't want you to be the window anymore. I want you to refer to something. And the way I do that is instead of calling my object directly, I append to it the call, literally treating it as if it was an object, because it is an object. And then I could go ahead in my first parameter, say, you're actually a clock. And if I go ahead and do that and I save this and I go back into my application, notice what my object is going to be. My object is going to be that clock. All right. Now, there's a couple of different objects that exist, and I wanted you just to be aware of them all. There are 2. One function that belongs to the function is a function that enables you to call the function itself and change its scope. So the first property would be the scope that you want it to be, and all the remaining properties would be the properties that you're expecting to get inside of that function. Another method, which is very, very similar, is instead of using the call, I'm going to use the live date. And I'm going to press apply. Now the only difference between call and apply, the first parameter is still the this that you want it to be. We still want it to be the clock. The next is going to be an array of values, and it's going to not, instead of sending it directly, I'm sending it as an array, which this could become incredibly handy if you have some information that's coming through and it's not coming and you don't know how many they're going to be. For example, with the date object that we're going to work with really soon, we don't know how many property the users is sending to the data object. We just want to pass it through. And when we create our live date, we don't really know what the properties are going to be, but we want to fetch them all and send them onwards. And that's exactly what we're going to look at in the next section when we go ahead and revisit the idea of prototype and see how do we inherit things now that we know that every function is also an object. Everything we've done thus has led us to this point in time. We were talking about the fact that really from a level of object-oriented programming, half of the idea is to be able to reuse your code and make it more clean. This is exactly where we're going to take it to the next level now, when we're going to start talking about inheritance, which will be the main topic throughout this chapter. What we're going to do is we're going to take our clock, we're going to take our digital clock that we have there, and convert it or really create a subclass of it or create a child of it that will lean on the features that are inside of the clock but add more functionality to it. That way we could expand different things, even built-in objects in most, by the way, not all, most built-in objects in JavaScript, we could expand their functionalities, but only if someone is a subclass. So let's jump into it and see it. It's really not complicated. It's actually a lot of fun. And really that's where your creativeness and object-oriented programming really starts to shine. Almost everything in JavaScript is inheritable, which basically means it's just like a relationship of parent and child, but it's a little bit more sophisticated than that. And the basic concept is this. If I come into a room and I say, "Do you have water?" And I'm asking me, someone's coming to me and asking me specifically, "Do you have water?" If I don't have water, I could then approach my mom and ask her, "Hey, could you get me a cup of water?" And in essence, that's exactly what it is. So, but this happens behind the scenes to the user, to whoever's asking me. So if someone's asking me, "Do I have water?" If I don't have any water, I'll ask my mom, "Do you have water?" If she says no, I just say, "No, I don't have any." If she says yes, I just pass it on and say, "Yeah, sure, I do have water." That is really the basic concept in inheritance in general. And it's really where we come to a place where we want to create a separation. For example, one of the clocks, our main clock, I would like it to be a textualized clock. So to do that, I want to create a new text clock, but I really don't want to create a completely brand new clock because it's literally the same clock, only with a different face, a different skin. And I would love to be able to re-leverage the clock that I had going on and only have it run as a different layout. You know, for example, I'm gonna set the secondary clock as a text clock. All right, so I decided that I'm gonna create a text clock. And don't forget that right now, I'm not going to do this with a date object. We're going to go back to this live date in a video or two, and we're going to talk about the date object, which is completely different than a lot of other built-in and regular classes that we build. The big difference is the date object, we can't inherit it. We cannot create a child of it. And we're going to look at why and how in a couple of videos. But for now, I want to scroll all the way down to where I created my clock right after the creation of my clock. And I'm going to go ahead and create a constructor for our text clock. And for now, I'm just going to keep it as an empty function that just has the same properties as our clock itself because we really want to be able to keep the same type of features and behaviors that are expected from it. Next step that I want to do is I want to connect this clock and literally tell JavaScript that this clock is based off of something that already exists. Now, we already met the prototype, and what we want to do is after we create our function, after we create this variable, I want to go right after that and say, by the way, your prototype is going to be something completely different. What will be your prototype? I'm going to go and create a new object using the object create, and I'm going to send into it the prototype of our clock. Now, literally what I'm doing right here, this is, by the way, only valid and only available modern browsers. So for example, IE9 would have it, but if you're running Internet Explorer 8, it won't work because object create doesn't exist. In the next video, we're going to look at how could we solve that and create a call that would work even if our version of our browser is an earlier version. Now, the process, what I just did right here is I basically told our text clock that its proper prototype is someone else. And that prototype is basically that object of digital clocks. It's going to be an instance of that clock. Beyond that, because I've done that, my constructor, by the way, my constructor, every single text clock in its every single object, every single function in its property, in its prototype property, has a variable called constructor. Now the constructor is by default the whatever it is. So for example, by default is the text clock. But once I create and override the prototype, it's going to actually change to be of the text clock, breaking the functionality. So I have to do it in two lines. Line number one, basically connecting a text clock's prototype to copy and duplicate everything that's inside of my clock itself by constructing a new clock. And step number two is to go to my prototype of my text clock and say, by the way, your constructor is still the same. Once I do that, everything should be working, although we won't see the time anymore for the second item. The reason why we're not going to see the time of the second item is very simple, is because all these variables that we're passing through are just staying right here. They're not going anywhere because our constructor is getting built off with nothing inside of it. And if I go ahead and I refresh my application, we're going to see that our secondary clock isn't really doing anything. It's not getting updated. We want to fix this. So the last step that we have to do, once that we know that this object is all connected, all that's left for me to do is to approach my actual constructor right inside of it. And what I want to do is I want to actually use that apply method. Basically, I want to go to that com.o2geek.clock, and I really want to call it. But I don't want to call it directly because I don't want it to have a different, I want it to be called as if it belonged to this object. So to do that, I'm going to call the apply. There we go, apply. So I'm going to call the apply, and as for the first parameter, I'm going to send this where we're in. For the second parameter, I really want to send everything that's here, but what if there was only 1 item or 10 items? I don't want to send in using the call, which we've seen already before. I really want to use the apply, and to do that, I'm going to take advantage of one more property that we didn't learn about yet, which is called arguments. Every single function has an arguments property that literally all it has is basically a list of all the variables that have been sent into it, indexed as an array. And the arguments array is a subset of the array that only holds basically what was sent inside to it. And literally just by that, I could send the arguments without needing to worry what were the arguments that were sent in. That way I could pass them through to my apply and actually initiate my clock using the same variables there, but updating it into my text clock. So now my text clock, when I'm actually creating it and setting it, will actually work just like a text clock. So if I go ahead here and I run it, our text clock should then be back and working. Now there was a lot of steps, and I want to just go through it one more time. So we said, first of all, we create this new constructor. That's step 1. We create a new constructor for a new object. It's called text clock. It's in the package of com.o2geek. The next step is we approach our prototype right after we create the method, and we basically call the object.create, which will help us create a new object that doesn't have a prototype. And what we do is we send in the prototype itself of that method, and it will automatically create for us that right object that we need. You don't have to worry about the details too much, because if you're trying to run an application that's running on a modern browser, then all modern browsers have this functionality and you don't have to worry about it. Step number 2 is the constructor itself, and in the constructor itself, we go ahead and basically reassign the constructor back to our constructor function, which this is our constructor function, which has all the rules and setups and configurations. What this does, it makes sure that whenever someone says new text clock, it will actually trigger this constructor, and that's exactly what we want happening. It's not going to automatically trigger the clock prototype, because then it would be no point in creating this. But instead of that, we'll automatically create our text clock, enabling us inside of it to actually refer back to that clock whenever we want to, and then do whatever else we need to do if there's other things we need to do in our construction, such as adding more properties or more methods or more things that are specifically that we want to do that are unique for our text clock that are not in our clock itself. That way we have that control. We first start with what we want to do inside of the clock itself, and then we continue with the specificalities that would relate to the text clock if there are any. In the next lesson, we're going to take a break from creating this project and completing this text clock, because we're going to have a problem, and you're going to have a problem if you're running with an older browser, and we're going to go ahead and fix that problem for users that just don't have the function object.create. Which if you're running on IE7 or you're running on an older browser in general, it just wouldn't work. So in the next lesson, we're going to come back and fix this problem for people that have older browsers before we continue on and actually create that unique text clock, which is the son or the child of the clock. In the last lesson, we created our first inherited object that inherited its properties from the main class object. In this lesson, we're going to go back into how we created it to change and create our own creator function, because this methodology that we did in the last lesson is only applicable to modern browsers. And if you want your application to work on older browsers, it just won't work the way we did it. So in this lesson, we're going to see how you would have done what we did in the last lesson, but the more traditional way of doing it. Let's get started. Lecture promising you that we're going to create the object.create, but basically recreate it to make sure that it will also work on older browsers. So to do that, I want to create a friendly helper function that its job will be to create the object for us. It's going to be very simple. I'm going to go ahead and it's going to expect to get a prototype. That's what we're going to send to it. What we want to do is inside there, we're going to create a function that's really going to be our constructor. Because what we want to do is we want to wrap up this prototype and literally tell it, you belong to someone else. You belong to Proto. Proto, you belong to this object that we're just about to create. And that's it. All we want to do is return this object with a new object, calling it for C because it's our constructor. All that's left for me to do is to go ahead and switch our create object and set it inside. Now I want to talk about it a little bit before we test it out and see it in action. What we're really doing is that the prototype expects to get an object, a completed object. And because it's expecting to get a completed object, we don't want to send to it our actual object. We don't want to create a new date directly in it because we don't want to instantiate the constructor of that object. We don't want to just put here this prototype with the full object. We want to have like a slimmed down version of the object so we could have control over when we're going to call its constructor and if we don't. Beyond that, what we're doing is we're basically sending that prototype, all that extra functions, all that extra functionality that's in there, and we're literally sending it inside of a new object that we're creating, a function called C. We're assigning to it that prototype and creating a new object that we know has no ties, no links, no anything that could create any problems for us because it's a completely clean object that is empty. And that's what we're sending into our prototype. And again, still we want to change our constructor as well. What we could do, by the way, if we want to, we could, instead of sending all this information, we could assign this as a secondary parameter to our create object and then assign all this information internally to save us a lot of space. Literally what we could do, if we want to, we could go ahead and just copy this information, this text clock, send it inside here, and then we could even beyond that define the constructor once we're done. All right? But I'm not going to worry about that. I'm going to keep those steps separate so it'll be very easy for you to see what's going on, the steps involved, because those are really important. But once you understand those steps, you are encouraged to create your own object creation process, such as this create object, and send inside the second parameter, basically sending inside the object itself, the function itself, the constructor itself, and I could call this the constructor. And I could send in that constructor, and what I want to do is basically go to that constructor and literally assign into my prototype to assign to it its constructor. And say, hey, by the way, your constructor is this guy, constructor. And by doing that, then I don't have to do this line anymore because I'm automatically or together attachfully doing it at the same time. And then I don't have to worry making sure that I'm assigning the constructor. But in general, when you're creating things, you might want to keep that separation in case in some situations you'll want to use a different constructor. But in general, this will probably be a good solution as you're starting to get used to things, because then you just have to remember to send in the prototype and the actual object itself, and then you'll assign it to your prototype. And even beyond that, you could even make a scenario that's even smarter than this. If you go ahead and just create a function that you would send into it, that full function, and then not need to even assign the prototype directly, because you could create the object and literally just go to that specific object and assign all this stuff internally, making these two lines not necessary. And I encourage you to do that as a homework assignment per se. I'm not going to do that right now, but that could save you a lot of aggravation. Once you figure it out and you create this function, then you could use it all the time and you don't have to worry about the chaining as much because you could set it and configure it on your own. But in general, it's a really good thing to get used to, because then it'll make it easier for you in the future as you're creating more complex chaining when you're connecting. And when I'm saying chaining is because I'm connecting the text clock, I'm chaining it to the clock itself. So if I go ahead here and just click on refresh to show you that our clock is still working and operational, we'll see that our clock is still ticking, everything is working, and now we're also browser compatible to older browsers as well. Now that we're browser compatible to older browsers, it's time for us to move to the next topic, which is how do you actually override functionalities? So if you have a child class, how do we make sure that if we want to have something different in a specific method, but it's not doing what we want it to do right now? How do we deal with that? And that is going to be our main topic in the next lecture. In the last few lessons, we started working with inheritance. But one of the things that you're going to encounter very often is sometimes you are going to want to change the functionality of a method that was set up and configured in a previous object, in a parent. How do you do that? That is exactly the topic of this lesson. Welcome back. It's time for us to abandon theory and start working in practice. So right now we have inheritance, but really it's doing the exact same thing. So what does it really help us? So let's go back into the clock itself, and I'm going to go into the clock section, and really the section that I really care about is the area where we're actually formatting our text and sending it into our clock. What I want to do is I want to separate the actual logic itself of the adding of the visualization elements into their own method. So I'm going to go ahead and create quickly a new method, and I'm going to call it in my prototype. And let's call this function format display. And really, in this case, what would make more sense is if I just call this format digits. That's fine, but format output. We'll call it format output. And I'm going to make sure that it's going to get 3 properties because we really want to have here the hours, the minutes, the seconds. So I'm going to go ahead here and send here the hours, minutes, and seconds. Those are the properties that it's going to retrieve, and we're going to actually return them. What we're going to do, we're going to return. And what do I want to return? I'm just going to go ahead and grab all this, and I'm going to go ahead, and I also want to add here also a label. So I'm going to go ahead and first step is I'm going to just grab all of this, and I'm just going to move it for a second into that method. So I'm going to go ahead and just put it right here. And what I'm literally doing is I'm basically returning back all that information. All that I'm going to do here is instead of calling, instead of using the date and all those stuff, I'm going to go ahead and send that information directly to the format output and literally first send inside the 3 time property. So that one would be the time get hours. So that's going to be our first property. So I could already update it to be H because that's going to be the variable name. The next item that we're going to send is the minutes. And if I cut that out, put it right up there, make sure that I refer it in the right spot, refer to it as M for minutes. And I'm going to continue on and move on to the next step. And the next step, I'm going to go ahead here. And where are we? So we set the minutes. It's time for us to set the seconds. I'm going to go ahead here, grab that seconds. And last but not least, we also want to send the label in, literally making this whole process a lot more dynamic. And if once I've done that, all that's left for me to do is to make sure that I get rid of the this. So I want to refer to this internal variable, and I want to make sure that I'm referring to the S for that seconds. Now, everything should work the same way, but now I have a separate function for the actual formatting. Now, if I go ahead and I just refresh my application, we're going to see that first of all, everything will remain and work the same. But now it opens the door for me to change the format. And literally what I could do is create this format text output. And if I'm just going to copy the actual function itself, I'm going to go ahead into my new clock, which was called text clock. And I'm going to add another property after I finished with the configurations of the prototype. I'm going to go ahead here one line below, and I'm going to go into my folder, into my namespace. And I'm going to go to my text clock, and I'm going to go into my prototype. And I'm going to add a new prototype item, which will be the exact same name as the method that we had in our clock. By doing this, I'm overriding that clock and enabling the user, which is me, to change the layout. So the most simple layout changes, I could go ahead here and just put here a dash, and that would be it. All right, that would completely change the way everything looks like. And if I go ahead and I click on refresh, we'll see the one item that is our item that we've just created using the text clock has a completely different layout than all the rest. And literally as the next step, I could go ahead and say, okay, let me set it to be, for example, hour, and I'll put here minutes, and I could put here also, let's say, seconds. And that was obviously in a real world scenario, I might want to also override the format digits and turn it from digits that are numbers into digits that are strings. But in my case, I'm just doing this for the sake of the example. And in our example, I just overrode the format, enabling me to create a completely different format for my text clock versus the regular clock. If we go ahead and click on refresh here, we'll see that now we have here a completely different layout of our copy. And I could have put here whatever I wanted to really. And that is a perfect example of inheritance and how you could leverage the fact that you're inheriting whatever you're inheriting. But beyond that, say, okay, I just want to change something specific. That forces you and makes it much easier for you to go back into your code and refactor it to try to make your basic objects that you're inheriting later on to be the smartest that you can, and split down into the components to the smallest components you can, because then it makes it much easier when you're actually working in a child object, which this is a child object, its parent is the clock. It will enable us more easily to go ahead and modify and change whatever things we need to change. So for example, if we wanted to update our clock, because this is a different version clock, we could go ahead and just copy this version property, and instead of referring to the clock itself, after we've set and configured our prototype, I could go ahead there and configure for our text clock to be a different version, because this is actually version 1.1. And if I save this and I want to, let's say, output it in my constructor, I could go in my constructor, I could go into the console and ask to log out this version. And when I do that and go back into my application and click on refresh, I'm not going to get 1.0 anymore, but I'm going to get 1.1 because that property is defined inside of my prototype chain in that specific item. If I go ahead and I comment it out, it's not going to be undefined. If it's not going to find it in this object, it's going to travel into the prototype and ask the prototype, are you there? Now, this is exactly the logic that works also if I take this text clock and create a parent on top of it. For example, in the next lesson, what I would like to do is take this text clock and convert it into an alarm clock. And the alarm clock will basically only trigger at a specific point in time and literally have there some sort of a copy that says, alarm, alarm, it is time for you to wake up, or something of that nature. We'll configure it and figure it out in the next lesson. But if I go ahead and I say, after saving it, commenting out the version, it will automatically go and approach its parent itself, to the the object that constructed it, which was the class itself, and fetch from it the version, which was version 1.0. In the next lesson, we're going to actually do a third level of inheritance as we turn this little alarm clock, this clock, into an alarm clock. We've done a lot in this chapter, and really the whole chapter was about inheritance. And this last lecture is going to be turning our clock into an alarm clock. And we're going to use inheritance, and we're going to actually inherit from the text clock. So literally, we're going to have your 3 levels of inheritance, and you can have as many levels of inheritance as you want. So let's jump right into it and with it wrap up this chapter. Okay, let's start our last exercise for this chapter, where we're going to take our clock and turn it into an alarm clock. But beyond that, we're going to practice inheritance a little bit further. So I'm going to go ahead and instead of creating a clock, I'm going to create an alarm clock. Beyond that I'm creating an alarm clock, I also want to send a few more properties, and one of them is the time that I want the alarm to take place. So I'm just going to comment this out for a second. Let's see, let me undo so we could actually see the time that was there. So let me just click there, undo, and we're going to set an alarm for, how about 2 or 3 minutes from now. So we're going to look at the clock. The clock right now is 8 and 1 minute according to this time zone. So I'm going to set my alarm even to 8 and 5 minutes. So to do that, I'm going to go ahead and we're going to create an alarm, and I'm going to go ahead and add our alarm time. I'm going to set it to 20 for the hours and for 5 for our minutes. And let's go ahead and create that alarm clock. Now to do it, I'm going to do the exact same thing as I did when I was extending the clock itself to create a text clock. I want to basically extend the text clock because I want it to be a text clock that is an alarm clock as well. So to do that, I'm going to go ahead and copy the same constructor that I have there because I want to start from a very similar place. Let me just break the lines here a little bit. But I'm going to call it instead an alarm clock. Beyond that, I'm not going to call the clock, I'm going to call the time clock, the text clock that is. So all of this here seems to be the same, but don't forget that we also added here 2 properties. One which was the hours, which will be hour, and we had their minutes for our alarm, hour, alarm, minutes. So just to make sure, ALM for alarm, ALM for alarm. So I know that it's an alarm. Now the next thing that I really want to do is I actually want to add those properties so I'll have access to them more easily. So I'm going to set my this alarm hour to ALMH, and this alarm M we're going to set to that ALM M. So I have access to it throughout my alarm clock. Let's not forget also that we also need to actually link these 2 together. So to link the two together, I'm going to go ahead and just copy the same logic that I just had there with our create object. And I'm going to go ahead here, and right after the creation of our alarm clock, I'm going to go ahead and send the text clock right into the prototype. It's prototype right in there, sending in also a reference to the actual alarm clock, so it's going to keep the right constructor. Once I've done that, that's it. I have an alarm clock, and I could go ahead and add whatever method I want. For example, I really want to override that format output again, because what I want to do is I want to check and see if the actual time right now, I'm just going to go ahead and create that function really quickly. Let me even copy this whole thing. And I'm just going to go ahead here. And really, from a copy perspective, I don't really want to change much, but I'm going to keep this copy the way it is for now. And what I want to do is I want to check to see if the hour right now equals this dot alarm hour, and also our minutes equals the this dot alarm minutes. And in that case, we want to trigger some sort of an alarm. So in that case, I'm going to return alarm, wake up, and any other case, I'm going to return that normal stuff that we were giving there. We go ahead here, set that, return the exact same format as we had previously. And we're going to look at another interpretation of this in a couple of seconds. But beyond this, really what I would love to do is also trigger some sort of a noise. So let's go ahead and also add that noise here. So I'm going to basically set and generally speaking, it's not always a good idea. Well, in general, it's not a good idea to have more than one return. One way you could avoid that is by creating here output as a string and then assigning the output value basically directly into your element instead of returning it. And then once everything is done, go ahead and just return that output. That is one way to avoid using two returns. If you're comfortable with two, which I am usually, then you're fine. But in general, it's recommended to always put one return in the end. It's just a common practice. Now, before we wrap this up, I really want to also create here a sound. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to create a new sound object using HTML5's new audio class. And the next thing that I want to do is I'm going to send into it in our art folder. You're going to find in the downloads, there's a beep.mp3. So I'm going to go ahead and send that beep and make sure that I'm going to start playing it immediately. And we're going to have a really horrible noise once we test this out. If it didn't take us too long, because we set our alarm clock to be at 8 and 5 minutes. So let's go ahead and see what the time right now is. It's 8 and 6 minutes. So I'm going to go ahead there and change our time to 8 and 7 minutes. And we're going to give it a test. I'm going to click on refresh. And that should be it, really. And in a couple of seconds, it should start running. Now for the next, I'm going to let it run in the background. But before we get to that stage where it's going to start squeaking, I'm going to say just one more thing. That every single property of that was inside of our basically text clock, if it doesn't find it in the text clock, if it doesn't find it, excuse me, oh, this is a mistake here. This should have been inside of our alarm clock. That was a big no-no. And there we go. And we're beeping away. So you might be surprised why we're beeping, but it's actually very logical. What we did was we extended the text clock. And by that, we basically made sure that every text clock was actually an alarm clock as well. So that's why it's beeping, but really we only want our alarm clock to be an alarm clock. So let's get back to it. So let me just also terminate this by getting rid of my sound. And there you go. And we have an alarm and we have alarm wake up going on. Now I just wanted to note another note. That was a mistake because I actually added it into our text clock. But I just wanted to say one more thing. So first of all, if we can't find the property inside of our alarm clock, it's going to go to the nearest prototype, which is the text clock. If it can't find it in the text clock, it's going to go to the clock itself. And that's exactly the process of inheritance. And you could create as many chains as you want, one chain per item. And you could create an endless amount of inheritances that way and create really complicated and really cool applications. So that's it. We're done with this chapter. We're not done with clocks because actually we're going to take our alarm clock and make it a real functional alarm clock in the next chapter. So let's get started with the last chapter of this course. Now what we're going to do right now in this lecture is I'm going to switch around and turn the alarm clock to not actually inherit from the text clock, just to show you how we could switch around inheritance whenever we want to. Beyond that, I'm also going to show you a new HTML5 property which enables us to edit different text areas, and we're going to use that to enable the user to go ahead and type the actual time he wants the alarm clock to start ringing. And that's what we're going to start off doing now, and then the next lesson we will continue that actual step. So the first step that I want to do, and we're moving kind of in a realm that is HTML5 exclusive, but a lot of the things that we're learning you could still implement also on non-HTML5 things. What I really want to do is I want to take this clock that's on the top, turn it into an alarm clock, but change it around where it's, instead of going to be using the text option, I want it to basically be the same clock that it is, only behind the hood have an alarm. Now beyond that, I want to be able to click on the element and basically change the time of the alarm instead of hard coding the value in advance. To do that, what I want to do next is I want to go back into my application, and step one is I'm going to switch around between the alarm clock and say I want the top item to be the alarm clock. And I'm going to also get rid of those extra parameters. We don't really need them anymore, especially now that it's a clock, but also the alarm clock won't need them because we're going to dynamically change those as the user clicks on that area. The next step is I want to make sure that the alarm clock doesn't extend the text clock, but instead it extends the clock itself. So let's do that. And go ahead and find the actual alarm clock, which is right here. And we want to make sure that we're not calling the text clock anymore, but actually calling the constructor function of the clock. And also when we're creating the clock itself, we want to make sure that we're sending into the prototype the clock and not the text clock. And that was as easy as lemon pie, to basically change who does our alarm clock actually inherit from. And now if I go ahead and I click on refresh, one is if I go back into my text here again, because we're seeing the text copy anyways, and that means we have one more place that we need to change, and that was in the format output itself. And we can see that here the output itself that we're generating is based on the logic of the text editor. And what I really want to do is I want to approach that original format output of the actual clock itself instead. So I'm going to go ahead here and just delete everything here and send into the output variable the value that comes back from the clock itself, but I just have to make sure that I call it as an apply function and say, hey, do what you're doing there, but do it as ourselves, and we're going to send inside an array with all those properties. Or we could just type here arguments. And that's all we have to do to make sure that we're going to get that original copy as well, because we're overriding that original output. So we're leveraging that capability of testing something, and then if not, we want to get that original output that we got from the format output that was tracing out to us, that was returning to us. So if I go ahead and I save this, and I click on refresh, we're going to see that now our clock should be working just the way we wanted it to work. Now, before we wrap up this initial lesson, basically initial lesson in this chapter, what I want to do is I want to make sure that this text is editable. And to do that, I'm going to go ahead back into the constructor itself and enhance it a bit further. So I'm going to go into my alarm clock constructor. I'm going to go ahead and create a new DOM object because I want to refer to this a few times. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to approach my HTML5 document.getElementById and ask for that specific item from the ID. Beyond that, I also want to go to that specific DOM element and let it know that from here on, it is going to be an editable element, calling the content editable and set it to be true. That's all I really had to do to turn my content to be editable. If I go ahead and I click on refresh, we're going to see that now my content is editable. I could literally go inside here and change copy, although it's going to refresh once a second, which is our next problem that we're going to need to solve, is that first of all, we want to make sure that we know when we're in and we know when we're out, so we could then let our clock know to not continue counting or not display the counting for a few minutes as we're working. And that's exactly what we're going to look at in the next lesson when we crack into events and ask that text to let us know whenever we're zoomed in or focused in and whenever we're focused out. So we'll see you in the next lesson where we do our first event listeners. We're ready to talk about the biggest and last major topic in this course, and that is events and callbacks. We're going to start off in this lesson talking about events, and saying how could we know when a user does something on the screen. Now by default, almost every HTML element has a plethora of different events that we could listen to. One of them is an event that lets us know when a user clicks into it or when there's focus on that specific item. Another one enables us to know when the user leaves that area, and with that we'll be able to control and freeze time and release time every time the user is in edit mode to edit their clock, getting us closer to creating that complete alarm clock. Okay, what I want to do next is I want to stop the clock when the user puts his mouse in and edits it and continue it when he's out. So to do that, I'm going to go back into that constructor of our alarm clock, and I want to also add an event to our DOM element. Literally, I'm approaching the DOM element, and what I want to do is I want to ask it to tell me whenever the user goes inside of that area. And to do that, I'm going to use something that's called add event listener. And literally, as the name implies, it's basically going to happen. It's going to let us call a specific function whenever we reach a certain point, whenever the DOM element wants to tell me something. In this case, I want it to let me know when that item is focused. And to do that, I'm going to create here anonymous internal function. And I'm just going to wrap it around and close the line here, making sure that I have access to it. And I'm going to go ahead here and do a console.log. And I'm going to log in, I'm in. And I want to do the exact same thing also for logging out. So I'm going to go ahead here and create a blur. Those are the two commands. The focus will let me know that I'm in, and the blur will let me know that I'm out. And if I go ahead and test this out, go back into my application and click on refresh, we're going to see that when I click inside, I'm going to see that I'm in. Once I release the mouse and go to a different position, we'll see that I'm out. That I need to do is figure out where could I stop the clock from ticking. And that's going to be our next challenge. So where is our clock ticks actually happening? The actual display itself is happening right inside of our format output. So what we could do is create another variable and say do update or do not update. So for example, if we just set this dot do update, I'll set it by default to be true. I could go ahead there and say to this do update to literally just wrap this whole format output around it. Moreover than that, to do format update probably here wouldn't be the right place, because where is this format output actually happening? It's happening way back in the actual clock itself. That's where we're adding that copy into that inner HTML. Now we really don't want to add here a logic that would basically override things here, because we wouldn't want to add extra functionality really in our clock when it's not needed. But when is the update clock being called? If we try to travel through, we're going to see that it's happening within the set interval. What if we could separate the step of the interval and turn the interval on and off whenever we need to? So that would be an extra functionality that would make sense to this object. So to do that, I'm going to go ahead and create another function here. I'm going to literally just copy the prototype right here, and I could have it start ticking. I could have it is, or maybe tick, and it'll be a function, and will be is tick. And if it is ticking, then we're going to want to make sure that we are going to start our interval. If we turn it off, we want to make sure that we're turning it off as well. So I'm going to go ahead here and I'm going to make sure that I'm going to add here basically a variable. I'm going to ask here for the, first of all, is tick. If it is ticking, I'm going to first of all clear the interval for, let's say, this dot my internal interval. Next step is I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to set that interval all over again. So I'm just going to cut that out, go right inside here, make sure that it's getting triggered. Beyond that, I could go ahead and also make a reference, and I'm going to just copy this whole logic set, put it right up here so we have access to that and also access to this, and literally just drop it right in here. Now all I really have to do is once I'm done with all these updates, I could just go ahead and say this dot tick and just set it to be true. So that's good. We're making sure that we're always ticking. Now beyond that, what I could really do is, well, first of all, what I need to do is make sure that when I'm configuring the new interval, that I'm always saving a reference to it now that I'm going to be able to turn it on and turn it off at any given time. Beyond that, I could go ahead inside here and cut this out, put this right above here. So make sure anytime someone calls, we automatically clear the interval. Not only do we clear the interval, we could put this whole logic inside of here, because only if it is ticking and only if we want it to tick, then we're going to start it all over. But if we don't want it to tick, then we won't. That way, whenever this is called, we're basically turning the tick on and now forgetting about it. We're not adding a lot of baggage to our application. The logic is incredibly similar. And now I could very easily take this.tick true and save this, go back to our alarm clock, and add that into the logic here, just first making sure that I have access to the this, which I probably won't. So if I put here, there's a comma, and put here this, a comma, and this, and just save it for a second, click on refresh, and try to look at the value that comes back when I click here, we're going to see that the access that I get is to the actual div itself. Now, I have a few ways around this. One, I could say, no, I don't want it to be the div. On the other hand, I could say, well, let me just create here a different variable, such as var that, set it to be this, and now this variable has access throughout the application, and I could go ahead here and literally say that.tick, set it to be false, basically killing our tick. And whenever we want it to turn back on, I could go to that.tick and set it back to be true. If I go ahead and test this out, save it, and test it out, we're going to see that once I click inside, the timer will stop, and now I can more easily decide what time I want my alarm clock to be, although we didn't configure it yet. And once I'm done, I could literally click out, and the clock will continue working exactly where it was. In the next lesson, we're going to come back into this example and complete it and make sure that we store that alarm clock time, because without storing it, then there's no point in having an alarm, right? Because it wouldn't actually do anything. So I'm going to go ahead, stop our recording, and in our next lesson, we're going to actually finish up this alarm clock. It's time for us to go back into that logic of the alarm. In the last lesson, we enabled the user to edit a text field, and now it's time for us to actually make sure that that edited text field will then trigger the alarm based on whatever the user typed in. And that's exactly what we're going to take care of in this lesson. Where we last left off, we had an editable area that would freeze each time we clicked into it and unfroze when we went out. But to make things more logical, what I want to do is when I click inside, I want the seconds area to disappear. Not only that, when I click out, I want to update our alarm clock to make sure that our alarm clock is in the right time. So let's go ahead and do that. And I'm going to go ahead and just jump first right into the focused area. And really what I want to do is I want to go to our this, which is the actual HTML DOM element. And I want to go to its inner HTML and I want to change it. To what do I want to change it? I want to take the inner HTML and I want to cut it. I want to slice it. From where? I want to slice it from position 0 until where? I want to position it basically to take it all the way until the last time that a semicolon is there. So inner HTML, and I'm going to ask for the last index of, and just send inside of it my colon. By doing this, if I save this and I go back into my application, we'll see that once I click inside and press on it, it will automatically get rid of the seconds so I could configure only the minutes. Beautiful. The next step is I need to basically capture the minutes and the seconds once I click out. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to go right in there, into our editor. And first I also want to make sure that I get rid of those extra parameters because they're just not valid anymore. But I am going to grab these parameters and just copy them with me because I want to put them inside of here just before we start ticking again. And we can't refer to that anymore. We want to refer to this. All the rest of our logic in our alarm clock should continue working just the way it should. All that's left for me to do is literally to go inside here and capture what this value should be. So I'm going to go ahead and create a quick variable, and I'm just going to call it A because I want to do it really quickly. And I want to go into my this.inner HTML, and what I want to do is I want to slice it, and I'm assuming that you're always going to put a valid value. Obviously, in a real-world scenario, we'd want to test and make sure that these values are really numeric. In my case, I'm going to trust you as our fellow learners that you're always going to put a number inside of there, but I encourage you to actually do go through making sure that you fix those type of bugs because those type of issues will create real serious bugs. So if I go ahead and save this, literally it should automatically work because everything everything in the logic here remained the same. So let's go ahead and give it a try and see if our alarm clock is actually working now. The time now is 4:40 and 37 seconds. I'm going to go ahead here and set my alarm clock to 4:41, and I'm going to click out, and we're just going to wait for a couple of seconds and to horrible noise. All right, so that definitely didn't work out. The question is, why didn't it work out? And that's a really good question because we did everything according to plan, at least. So how about we trace out and make sure that the values that we're getting there are actually numbers. So I'm going to go ahead even and just make sure that I parse int to make sure that I'm going to convert it from a string into a number. But I'm going to go ahead here and I'm going to just do a console log to see the value. That.almh, that.almm. So we're definitely getting close, and it's part of the game of developing. So I'm going to just click here on refresh, go inside, click back out just to see the values that are coming back. And is the time now 1 and 6 minutes? Absolutely not. So these are not the values that we really want to get. So for some reason, when we're clicking out, the conversion itself is returning values that are irrelevant. Moreover than that, it seems like it's returning the first 2 digits. So if we go ahead and test this out to see why is this happening, one thing that I'm getting here is that I'm by mistake using the slice command instead of using the split command, because the slice command basically gives us, it slices a portion of the elements. But what I really wanted to split our elements and turn them into an array, that was my error. And it's sometimes these errors are quite hard to catch. Now the reason why I realized that was because I store the value 1/6. So then I went back to that function that was supposed to split things and said, well, I wasn't really sending 1 and 6, was I? And then I noticed, okay, I'm using a slice instead of a split. So if I go ahead here and click on refresh one more time, we're going to see that now when I click in, I'm going to get basically, I'm going to set it to, let's say, 4. All right, so let me just set it for a second, 10 and 10 minutes, just so we'll get our time back. And I'm going to go right in here and just immediately click out, which would give me an alarm clock because these values should be the same values of the current time. And there we go, alarm wake up. And once we click in, the alarm is over. We could relax now. I could set the alarm now back to, let's say, midnight. And we are all set. And there we go. We just created an incredibly dynamic alarm clock. And together we troubleshooted all the little problems that we had. And we're done. We have a completed alarm clock. We're not done with the topic of alarm clocks, although, because we still want to talk about a couple of more things related to events, such as dispatching events. Because so far, all we're doing is listening to them, but we've never actually dispatched one. In the last few lessons, we've been working with listening to events, and I encourage you to continue exploring how to listen to events. There's many events out there. In this lesson, we're going to show you how could you actually trigger an event using the dispatch event method. Now again, not every single thing in JavaScript could dispatch events, only specific things, and you'll have to open up the documentation for that. But in general, it's things that are connected to the stage in general. All right, so let's see how could we dispatch events in this lesson and use it to advance further our alarm clock. Before we wrap up our conversation about events, I want to show you how to dispatch them as well. Now, it would be really wonderful if you could dispatch events anywhere, but actually you can't. Only objects that are connected to the DOM itself could dispatch events. So to be able to figure a way for us to basically leverage that just for the sake of this example right now, what I want to do is I want to go back into the dispatch events that we've created of the focus and the blur. What I want to do here is test to see if the values here are really numeric values that are in the valid ranges of values. So to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead here and instead of just, let's just do it step by step. I want to basically just ask here if our hours is in that range, right? Which basically says that it's greater or equal to 0. And it's also smaller or equals to 23, or actually smaller than 24. That would work as well. And then we're going to make sure that these two are just together, just so visually so we could see it. And I'm just going to copy this as well, just so I could type less. And I'm going to go ahead and approach the minutes as well. And for our minutes, I also want to go ahead here and set here the same type of logic construct. But this time around, I want to say that if it's greater or equal to 0 or smaller than 60. So that way we know that our values that we're getting back are numeric values that we could work with. If they are numeric values that we could work with, and only in that case, we want to dispatch an event that will say basically that the value is basically a valid value. So let's go ahead and do that. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new event. And I'm just going to call it new event and send into it basically a value that says some sort of a custom string, which could be anything. In our case, I could say, because our goal here is, I could say restart tick. So I could say here restart tick. That would work for me. I'm doing the event of restart tick, although really the more logical construct would be valid value or something of that nature, but I'm not going to play around to try to figure out a really great variable. I want to show you the next step. The next step is I want to approach the actual DOM element. And because I'm inside of the actual DOM element, I'm in this listener, I could literally go to that element and ask it to dispatch another event. And literally just send into it that event. Now that's all I really had to do to dispatch an event. If I go ahead here and I just click back into my application and click back here on refresh, we'll see that we're not going to see any difference in our application, besides that we just triggered our alarm clock. So I'm going to stop that immediately. But I want to now show you how do we actually listen to these events. So again, I'm going to go outside of this DOM event and I'm going to go right underneath it and I'm going to do the exact same listening as I did previously. So I'm going to go to my DOM and I'm going to add an event listener, just like I did with the blur. And I'm going to go ahead here and ask to listen to restart tick. And when restart tick happens, I could literally just go ahead here and maybe encapsulate a function right inside here and just have it to call that tick to turn back on. And I'm going to make sure that way if I run my application and it's not a valid tick, then although it's going to update the alarm clock values, it's not going to actually trigger the alarm tick again. In other words, if I save this and if I go back into my application and I click on refresh here, but this time around I send here maybe X for my number instead of an actual number, and I step out of it, it's going to tell me that it's null, it's not a number. The clock is not going to start ticking as long as I don't have a valid value here. And until I come back in here and literally go ahead and send inside a completely valid time, and click out of it, that is only then the clock will start ticking again. Now the reason behind that and the rationale behind it is because only if these conditions are matched, then we're generating this event. And then later on, we're listening to that event and triggering something based on that event. Now in general, we only could do this if we're using anything that is in the side of the DOM. But in general, you could work around and create hacks that just adding something onto the stage and using that to dispatch events. But it's not a very clean way of doing things. And in general, you don't really have to. And in the next lesson, after we've seen how this works, I'm going to go back into our date object because the date object itself can't dispatch events. But really what I want to do is I want to find a way for us to cut down the amount of intervals that we have. Because in our clock itself, we also have an interval. So if I go into the clock itself, if I find it somewhere here, in our clock itself, we see that we're creating this tick. And in the tick, we're setting an interval. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we could piggyback on that one interval that exists inside of the date, basically telling it, hey, every time you update, please let us know about it. And that's exactly what we're going to look at how to do in the following lecture when we take a look at callbacks. Congratulations, you have reached the last lecture in this title, and you're ready to start working in the world of object-oriented programming in JavaScript. There's one more topic that I really wanted to cover before we wrap this up, and that is callbacks. We've met callbacks already, we just didn't give them that name. And the idea behind a callback is that we pass a function directly to some sort of a method and ask it, hey, trigger this whenever you are ready. And that's exactly what we're going to do now. We're going to create a very sophisticated callback that in many ways is very similar to actually how events work behind the scenes. So let's jump right into it and with it complete this course, complete our alarm clock, and enjoy the last lecture. So I wanted to regroup back into the date object. And just as a reminder, When we created the date object, we said we really don't want this interval that we had taking place to basically be called more than once. So we'll have only one interval. To solve that, we said, how about we create the add to interval function and then send into it the date and push into that date into an array. And then only if there is no interval, then run the interval that will call the update dates. And then the update dates ran through every single item there, triggering the call of update seconds. All that was great. But we have not necessarily a problem. This is actually really fantastic. But what we really want to do right now is we want to leverage this interval logic to also work for our clock itself. Instead of having our clock having a clear interval and set interval, what we really want to do is we want to pass in that interval to our clock. To be able to do that, what I'm going to do is I first want to explain something here. The most simplistic way of creating a callback and the most simple thing is you just send a value into a function and then trigger that function whenever you want to, just like we're triggering here a function, but just one. Because we created an array, and in a sense, we created a hybrid between an event dispatcher and a callback, because a callback could only call back one function. And we're not going to even look at it because we already know how to do it because we created something a lot more complex than that. What I want to do is I want to take this complicated example and make it even more complicated. Doesn't that sound like fun? So the next thing that I want to do is I want to go ahead and literally add to interval from outside of the date object itself. Literally, basically saying I want to add another, I'm going to send instead of only sending a date, I'm going to actually send functions into it. So I'm going to go ahead and literally where my this is, where I'm creating the tick itself, which is happening right here, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to add it into our interval. Now, even before that, I'm going to actually put it right here, because one thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to, for a second, disable the ticking, enabling, and disabling, because I want to make sure that at first it's working before I do anything in configuring and making sure that also the ticking, disabling, and enabling actually works. And what I'm going to do in my constructor of the clock, I'm going to go ahead and call the date add to interval and send into it the function that we want to have trigger every single tick. And what is the function we want triggering every single tick? It's this anonymous function that we've created earlier that would update our clock. It would call the update clock. So I just want to make sure that I also am referring to this. And actually, I'm going to have to refer to that. So I'm going to have to create here a quick variable, call it that, set it as this, and then I'm going to pass through that variable. Now, right now, I'm sending inside of the date add to interval a value that's a function. And it's not expecting a function, it's expecting a date object. If we go back into it, we'll see that it's not only is it expecting a date, when it's looping through, it's also triggering one of its functions. So if I go ahead and I click on refresh, we're going to see that we're going to generate here an issue, an error. It's not going to work. To solve this problem, we want to add here an else, if else condition, literally saying if you are an object, then do this. If you're something else, do something else. So I'm going to add here an if statement, and I'm going to ask if this item is an instance of a date, then go ahead and just do what you were doing before. If not, let's not do anything. So all the items that are not dates are going to just completely be ignored. And if I go ahead and save this and refresh my application one more time, we should see that now. And now that we could see that we don't have any error, the next step is to actually make sure that we also trigger the function that will make sure that will actually update our display. So to do that, I'm going to go ahead and add an else if statement. And I'm going to ask if this item that we just got back, instead of being a type of a date, is it a type of a function? If it's a type of a function, what do we want to do? We want to trigger it. I'm going to make sure that it's a type of function, uppercase F in this case, and I'm going to go ahead and trigger that specific function. Now, if all works to plan, and I save this and it all works to plan, then now our visuals should update every time we click on once we click on the refresh button, our function will start updating, which it does. And now we just killed the need to have our own timer. Now there's only one timer involved. Again, let me just walk you through this just to make sure that it's crystal clear. I've added into the date add interval. Basically, now we're sending things that are not dates as well. And the next step for me is I need to make sure that if we are a date, I'm going to call the update seconds because it's an object actually. And if we're sending in a function, I want to make sure that I'm going to call a specific function. And for example, we might have every other type of function that's being called. Just call the update function. For example, we could add here another else if statement checking to see if that item actually has a update method. So literally we could do here another else that would work like this. If this item, first of all, exists and it's a valid value, that would be the first property. And the second property I would say is not only is it valid, it's got to be also valid and have the property update. Notice how I'm casting this inside of a round bracket. I could do that as well, or I could just type dot update. That would work as well. As long as this exists, we're assuming that it's an object. That is a great question because we probably could say that we could check if it's an instance of an object. But in this case, we're going to just assume that most chances are that everything here is okay, and then we would call the update function. And this way, if we know that we have different objects that need to be updated once a second, we don't need to create a new interval for them. All we have to do is just register them into our smart date and literally just have one interval running all the time. Now, before we run this, I also want to make sure that we talk about one more thing, is that now that we configured our interval this way, and we're not calling the tick true, we are calling it though in our events. So we are calling it, if I find the event in our alarm clock down there below, we're still using that logic inside of our tick false and tick true. Tick true, where are you, tick true? There you go, tick true. So for us to solve this problem, what we really need to do, we could or go ahead and refactor this area, or instead of that, we could go inside of our main code, add a little bit more logic into it. For example, inside of our tick function itself, we could literally just go inside there. If I could find it in a second, I will, in our clock. Let's find that tick function. Let me go ahead and do a quick search. .tick. Oh, I just missed it. And I just missed it again. Oh no. Can't believe I'm doing that. All right, here we go. So instead of clear interval, that's completely irrelevant now, right? We're not going to clear interval it. But what we could do is we could basically set our global isTick function, is ticking, set it to be whatever isTick is. And now we could literally go to specific places where we want to basically block the ticking and block it manually. Another option is to add a logic inside of our date object to remove a callback that was added in. I'm not going to go through that as well because that's something that you could probably figure out, and it would be a great exercise that I would love to see as well. So you could always email me and I would love to see it, or send me a note on Twitter and I would love to see what you did. But to solve, just to make our application work and wrap up this course, I'm going to go back now that we have a new variable that we said was called isTicking, and I could just go ahead and just define where should we have that configured, which basically would probably be right here where we're actually updating the clock. So within the update clock, I could just literally just decide, all right, I'm going to wrap this around an if statement saying only if you're clicking, then actually update. So although it will be called, it won't actually do anything if the clock is not ticking. And there you go. We just completed our application, I believe, because if we go back into our application and click on refresh, we're going to see that even doesn't matter what is sent in later on, if I click inside, this item will not update anymore until I actually move out of it and it is re-triggered. So if I go ahead here and just type your X and move out, it still won't trigger. But if I go back inside of here and type inside the actual time, let's say I want it to be at 12 to click, then our time will reset back to its own self and continue clicking again. And that's it. We completed our course on object-oriented JavaScript. There's a lot more that you could learn about object-oriented programming, but this is way more than enough to get you started and running and really exploring the world of object-oriented programming. And I hope to see you and your work. Just feel free to send me Twitter updates and let me know what you're doing. Would love to hear from you, and you could follow me at Zero2Geek. And I'll just leave it on the screen. You could follow me at Zero2Geek on Twitter. Thanks.